A former merchandiser, deeply disillusioned with people, wrestled with the contradictions of human nature until, in lonely stretches, a crushing urge to erase himself, turn off his phone, delete his accounts, vanish completely, would slam into him. And yet he surrendered to that melancholy and crawled back into his routine, baffled why those urges tormented him. Other people's words and deeds had shackled him for years, until a sudden lottery win ripped his life open. He quit his job, moved to a quiet town in Hokkaido, and dove headfirst into farming, sure it was the only path time had carved for him. He cursed, stomach dropping as he realized he'd been yanked into an RPG-like world. Alien landscapes, twisted architecture, and bizarre creatures crowded him, turning his confusion into panic. He spun sharply and shouted, "What kind of place is this?" A breath escaped him, relief like warm sunlight, and he decided this was enough for now. He stretched skyward like a lazy giant and declared, "Freedom is wonderful." Then his thoughts snapped back to this strange world. Everything felt bizarre, unfamiliar, and electric. Panic had crashed over him when he first arrived, but he quickly steeled himself and vowed he'd manage. Amid the chaos, he was hurled along with his chicken coop and a shed crammed with farming tools. The hens still laid edible eggs, and those tools let him forage wild plants, so he knew he wouldn't starve anytime soon. In that other world, magic and abilities existed. He hurled out chants and struck frantic poses, begging the air for any reaction. And then, he bit into the durian fruit and information exploded before his eyes. The skill worked, but was limited. Detailed analysis only kicked in for things he intended to eat, so he wondered if boiling the fruit with the magical herb called virgin might produce something useful. Spotting the monster, he sprang into action, baiting it into a trap he'd prepared earlier, backing away on purpose and roaring to grab its attention and make it follow. The moment the beast stepped into the trap, he yelled that it had worked. Pumped that the trap had sprung, he tore open his character menu and watched his stats explode as he vaulted from level 2 to 3. The first time the status window had slammed up when he hit 2, he'd nearly jumped out of his skin, and now it barely registered. Yet the moment level 3 blinked at him, his grin died. 3 felt hopelessly weak. After he butchered the monsters, he appraised them, and a status window flashed that a non-human creature inhabited the whole Lancaster region. He wondered if it was a goblin, or if Lancaster was just the area's name, rifled through the loot and grabbed only the gear, and knew he had to use anything that could help. His survival depended on it. He lunged to his workspace and immediately put the collected stones and medicinal herbs to work. He grabbed a firestone, throbbing with heat, and a femtostone for grinding, smashed them to dust, blended the grit until sparks roared and an abrasive flame bloomed. And if he polished the goblin's dagger with that, it would become a fire dagger. The hero realized the grinding material could graft new properties onto other weapons, so he vowed to hoard every useful resource and turned to herbs. He had Irene's healing herbs, the magical herbs of the Virgin, and the recently found fruit of the potato weed. Irene's herbs mended wounds and became potion ingredients, and the petals of the magical herb of the Virgin restored magical power and energy. He strained the infusion with steady hands and grinned. The potion had worked. It restored physical strength, mended medium-level wounds, and refilled magical power and energy. He knew ordinary medicinal herbs acted too slowly, needed massive amounts and caused complications. So he snapped to a wilder plan. Brew the poisonous herbs Boudur and Gadel into a potion that would absorb fast and kick in immediately. And since he knew the herb batter sapped physical strength while Gadel clouded the mind and triggered hallucinations, this could give very interesting results. He weighed the potion, proposed combining it with an antidote, downed the brew and swallowed the herb Marlene. It neutralized the toxins of Gadel and Boudur and blunted milder poisons. But his body gave out. He collapsed to the ground and sat there fighting to clear his head while bitterly realizing anyone watching would call him a fool. The hero concluded the potion was a lethal poison and coated his arrow tips with it for battle. Then his mind snapped to growing plants. If the herbs dug up with their roots were replanted in ordinary soil, they'd likely take and thrive. And a sudden sharp realization made him exclaim, "This wasn't just poison. It was real bait." His eyes went wide. The chicken wings gleamed far brighter after he'd fed the flock some herbs, so he grabbed a bird and activated Evaluate. It confirmed the chicken had become a grass chicken, its meat now packed with nutrition, strength-restoring power, and detoxifying effects, and he yelled in disbelief as the idea that tonic herbs might interact with medicinal herbs exploded in his mind. He'd already hacked apart the chicken carcasses, tossed the roast onto the fire he'd seasoned with the healing herbs to test, and when the first bite hit his tongue, he couldn't hide his awe. It was divine. And as he savored every piece he cried the bird's life hadn't been in vain. He dug a small makeshift grave for the chicken, felt a sting as a shard of that life would stay behind, drew a deep breath to gather himself, then set off to the city to sell everything he'd made. He knew that, as an ordinary Japanese man, there were many things he couldn't craft by hand, and so he had to get rich to buy them. And even after calculating the 3-hour round trip, his resolve didn't budge. He croaked tiredly, legs dragging like dead sticks from the long walk, then spotted an old man leading a horse and wondered if he could buy one in the city. At the gates he strode up and proudly declared he was a merchant. But when the guard answered, he only blinked. He didn't understand a word. He lifted his potions and herbs, declared himself a merchant, and the guard let him through without a single question. He still couldn't understand the locals' language, but didn't bother memorizing it, knowing sell, buy, thank you. A few greetings and numbers would cover every trade, so grinning he plunged confidently deeper into the city. By sheer luck, he stumbled into an adventurers' guild in the city and joined. Inside, a battered notice board plastered with jobs loomed beside a cash desk that handed out details on achievements and rewards, and the hero marched straight to the board, scanning every posting with hungry focus. He'd spent his days hauling long-toothed sea bass and now faced a brutal choice: submit or join forces and fight. He couldn't understand the local tongue, which tangled every move, and the moment he stepped out of the Adventurers Guild, someone suddenly called to him. 2 people hailed him: a petty trader and Margot, the city's weapons and armor dealer, both especially cared for in this city. He greeted them, whipped out a fiery dagger and brandished it. Margot's eyes widened and he loudly declared he'd buy it on the spot, and the hero instantly realized weapons with special properties were wildly popular here. He chose to sell the fiery dagger to Margot, and the merchant's wife exploded with anger, eyes flashing with displeasure, but it didn't faze him. He could forge more. Margot tried to speak. The hero caught the gist and realized they were asking him to move to the city, so he answered without hesitation. He refused, determined to keep his solitary life. Those recurring urges to sever himself from everything that had gripped him in his past life could flare up here too, and he never knew when they'd strike. He couldn't forge bonds with people. Migration hadn't fixed that. But he'd scraped together enough gold to buy a horse and tried to communicate it by scrawling the words on a small chalkboard. And apparently the country's language was called Lancaster. He used the skill appraise on the Japanese sentence and it snapped into Lancaster. The translation crawled, but at least they could write to each other. Merchant Sarasa flashed a sign she'd help him buy a horse. The hero pinned his hopes on her. She slipped away, leaving him baffled, and he clenched his patience and waited, convinced that was best. Lady Sarasa burst back leading a horse, her speed startling him. He pressed the gold coins into her hand, took the horse, deciding the ride home would be much easier, finished his business in the city, said goodbye to Merchant Margot and Lady Sarasa, and then headed back. Margot and Sarasa trailed the hero all the way to his plot, and it thrilled him not a bit. After he bought a horse, he suddenly had a stable, so they immediately built him somewhere to keep it, then even offered to raise a forge, which left him utterly baffled. He thanked them and froze in a slight daze, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He abandoned city life, terrified those sudden impulses that once haunted him would strike again. Cocooned in his shell, he pushed everyone away without meaning to. And Margot and Sarasa, despite everything, kept gently chipping at his walls as if they couldn't bear to leave him. Everything had already ripped past the tidy lines of simple business. Something raw thrummed between them that he couldn't, or wouldn't, face. And he kept from forging any chains beyond what was absolutely necessary. Plans ignited and worries took root, and he'd owe those two a proper thank you later. With the extension finished, the hero rocketed up to merchant farmer rank, while his new horse Ronan padded through the stable, nosing every beam and stall as he slowly claimed his new home. Margot and Sarasa, merchants from Lancaster, redrew his farm and slapped on a forge and a stable, complete with a chicken coop and a barn for tools. The hero grinned at the extra room to stash his creations, convinced he could finally forge and brew elixirs without fearing monster raids. So he tested the setup by simmering a decoction of the magical herb virgin and the antidote herb marina. The heroes swarmed his work, eyes ablaze when they saw he'd brewed a new restorative potion that neutralizes medium-level poison but only in tiny doses. He plotted to split it, stash one for himself and sell the other. Then prowled the forge and realized they could do more than stockpile supplies. They could ramp up production, his blacksmithing at its peak. Yet he hesitated about mass-producing attribute weapons and paused to plan a proper thanks for Margot and Sarasa. Gratitude pounded in him, but he had no idea how to thank Margot and Sarasa. A treat? A proper dinner? All he really had was a pinch of salt. Rest of City's stalls hawked shelf-stable fare like dried meat and hard bread, so fresh ingredients would bring real joy, and he saw himself using the leafy plants as house herbs and splitting the meat 3 ways, though including the chicken would mean at least 2 birds for a full meal, and eating more would cut into the egg stash. Those grass chicken eggs weren't just nutritious. They restored strength and even cleansed the body. The hero had lost his taste for hunting now that he was a farmer, but the hunter's urge flared up, at least a rabbit. Confident he could handle it, he saw one of his traps twitch with a catch and bolted to check, and found a snarling, wolf-like monster trapped inside. He'd arrived just in time. A level-up slammed into him and his blood raced. Did that make him a cheater? Could levels spike like this? He tore open skill evaluation, and it spat the truth. A wolf monster, the kind that prowls all over Lancaster, stood before him, and he figured it would make perfect food. The guild's dismantling shop hauled him to safety. He'd never cut up a wolf and bungled it, so he had time to wait. Killing time, he scanned the bulletin board and one quest leapt out. Chicken? No, it's a pacify assignment. But who is a cockatrice? The pacification mission wasn't his concern, but suddenly Dan, the Adventurers Guild administrator, strode up to the hero, and he couldn't make out most of his words, only the name Kai cutting through the noise. What did that mean? Should he follow? Okuda aimed assess at the sign and it revealed a dojo. The instructor stepped forward, Kai, and greeted him as Kigo. A prickling premonition told Okuda something important might happen. And after greeting them, he wondered if this was where he'd finally learn the combat skills he'd long wanted for self-defense. He shot a quick thanks at Kai, then locked onto the dojo leader as he obliterated the training dummy with one thunderous blow and tried to gauge the raw force behind it. Kai thrust a wooden sword forward, daring the hero to try. The hero snatched it, dropped into a fighting stance, the sword in his hands flared to life, and he drove it into the dummy. He snatched the skill strike, thanked Kai, spotted a sign as he left the dojo and translated it. Monster attacks were killing too many adventurers, so martial artist Kai was offering newcomers free combat strike training. He stood slack-jawed as Master Kai's strike cleaved the air, realizing that with the right training, those techniques could become devastating tools. Grateful the dojo had shown him he could gain skills beyond mere appraisal, he grabbed ingredients to cook a thank-you meal for Margot and Sarasa, and headed home. On the way home, the hero spotted a stone goblin statue, then his gaze locked onto cockatrice. Suspecting danger, he cracked the reins and shot his horse into a furious gallop. He bolted into the barn, crushed the chicken to his chest, sank by the door shaking and sobbing. A knock made him shudder, then he dared to think, could it be a person? Heart hammering, he cracked the door and seeing merchant Sarasa, hurled himself into her arms, clinging and letting his tears pour out as relief exploded into louder sobs. The merchant's wife, hearing his sobs, asked him again if he was scared. The hero sobbed on until he spotted Margot and a stranger nearby, then forced himself back together, mortified that he looked so pitiful in front of someone he'd only just met. Margot dropped the name Cockatrice, and the hero's memory snapped to the quest. He wondered if Margot, Sarasa, and that adventurer-looking stranger would head out to pacify the monster, and as calm settled over him, he decided to simply rely on them. He had no clue what was unfolding, but he acted, racing to ready the weapons and medicines he'd stockpiled and hand them to whoever needed them. After sliding every last essential item across the table, the hero watched Sarisa slam a sketch down, a daring plan to pacify the cockatrice, and lay out their next moves. He blurted, "You want me to attack with a bow?" He couldn't believe they were dragging him into this scramble to subdue a cockatrice. He'd only just been a trading company employee in another world, and in this game-like realm, it was insane to gamble his life just because someone ordered it. Margot, Sarasa, and the unknown adventurer surged around Kigo, firing up his courage as they urged him to stick together, insisting teamwork was safer, and swearing they wouldn't let the cockatrice hurt him. Kigo refused to let fear paralyze him. Doing nothing would change nothing. His solo odds were slim, so he steeled himself to subdue the cockatrice, clinging to the hope he'd make it home alive. Seeing the cockatrice, the hero's jaw dropped at its colossal size, and a hot envy for Sarasa, who'd stayed behind to watch over the house, surged through him. After confirming Margot and the adventurer were in their positions, he locked his gaze on the battle ahead. He drew his bow and loosed a poisoned arrow that buried itself in the cockatrice. His allies roared and surged forward, unleashing the attack. With the cockatrice defeated, he realized his allies were probably higher level than him. The monster locked onto him, began charging a savage attack, and he felt a bone-deep certainty he couldn't dodge the blow. The adventurer hurled the hero aside at the last second, and thanks to that they managed to partially evade the cockatrice's attack. Stone began crawling over the hero's flesh after the cockatrice struck, and as Margot guarded the adventurer and Kikaku, she shouted about a detox potion. The hero ripped one free, shoved it into the adventurer's hands, and slammed his own down. Margot had cockatrice's muzzle pinned to the dirt, and the hero knew his only chance was a double counterattack. Outmatched but not beaten, he'd have to time a skill strike with the adventurer's blow. He sucked in a breath, snatched his weapon, steadied his mind, and together they slammed their attacks in one thunderous all-or-nothing strike. Their combined counterattack hit home. The cockatrice unleashed a final ear-splitting scream and crumpled, drained of strength, while the hero and the adventurer gasped and knew the fight was over. The beast lay pacified. Heigo Akuta rocketed to a higher rank, gaping in disbelief that their party had actually subdued the cockatrice, and while he reeled, the adventurer stepped forward and introduced himself. Kigo missed most of it, but snatched the name Juno, shook off his confusion, and thanked Juno and Margot for their help in the battle. The hero realized that even if each ally was powerless alone, the three of them had carved out victory together. He saw one arrow, maybe himself, was far more brittle than it looked. Maybe he'd just been lucky this time. But what chilled him most were the dark impulses gnawing inside him, urging him to end all this once and for all. To honor their victory over the strongest cockatrice, a small celebration erupted as Keigo treated Margot, Sarasu, and Juno, this time seasoning the meat with garlic and salt, even though it had been mouth-wateringly good plain. And he urged everyone to eat their fill and savor every bite. Keigo believed a well-cooked meal could speak 1,000 feelings, so he brought more drinks to keep the feast's warmth crackling, and deep down sincere gratitude burned for Juno, who helped him tame the cockatrice, and for Sarasa and Margot, whose stable and forge had become his anchor. Mid-meal, they saw blue wolves closing on the camp. The hero counted 3 and guessed the predators had been lured by the smell of the food he'd cooked. The hero's eyes widened. Monsters of terrifying power appearing at the scent of food was a jaw-dropping anomaly, and he refused to strike unless they showed aggression. Kago's companions read his intent and flat-out ignored the blue wolves, keeping to their meal, while he caught Sarasa smiling at him and silently begged her to stop laughing so much. He chose neutrality, refused to sow needless hostility, and after all he'd been through swore he'd never be easy prey again. Survival mattered more than defeating enemies, so he'd cut out every possible risk. After sending his companions back to the city, he began scraping plates and stacking pots. Sure, he'd thanked Margot, Sarasa, and Juno, and even stolen a few practice strikes, then scanned the field where the blue wolves had prowled and braced himself if they dared cross into his territory. The hero gouged pits and stitched them into a crude nest trap, piled bundles of poisonous herbs over each hole, slipped into the brush, and waited for the blue wolves to return. Keigo strung a crude rattle alarm all around his property, fashioned with his own hands, primed to scream the moment the blue wolves dared to drop in on him. He hauled out the tiger trap he'd bought from the guild, rigged it into the earth, and when the last peg bit down, conviction surged. He was safer now, and his odds of surviving had soared. Though he lived on the outskirts, Kago hammered up a warning sign to shout that people lived here and could be dangerous. With the outside work finished, he stowed his tools, eyed the hut, and decided repairs could wait while he forged a shield first. Keigo let out a relieved exhale. The cleaning had been the same brutal grind as any tedious chore. Once you start, you can't stop. He saw the boards were completely gone. No surprise since he'd fashioned so many things from them today, and that tiny chicken coop hut had become his home, built with his own hands. At last dinner hit the table. Keigo seared a blue wolf steak laced with Ireno's medicinal herbs and a pinch of salt, decided to wash it down with a Milanese fruit liqueur that suited the meat, and even though it was the same food as lunch, every bite still tasted delicious. The alarm howled and Kiko's mind shot to the wolves that had been roaming by day. Fear twisted in him as he grabbed his weapon and crept out of the hut, hoping these were just people needing something and not the same predators he'd seen earlier. Keigo burst from the hut and froze. A blue wolf lay caught in a trap, shattering his hope they were human. Knowing he had to deal with the remaining pack member first, he snapped his bow taut and loosed an arrow straight at the trapped wolf. Only 2 wolves remained, and Kiko scanned the shadows with every sense sharpened. No members of the pack were in sight, which tightened his gut. They hadn't vanished, and as he peered into the black for the tiniest movement, he realized the last predators were likely hiding nearby, ready to pounce. Wolves exploded out of the brush and pounced on him from both sides. Kago barely had time to react. His heart thundered, his body snapped taut to defend itself, and he knew that if he failed to fend them off, he would be in serious danger. In one fluid motion, he drove his sword through a wolf, then slammed his shield into the second, sending it crashing into the trap nest. He ripped his sword free from the fallen wolf as adrenaline surged through him, drowning his fear in a wild roar. Only one wolf remained. He bellowed the command to attack, unleashed the skill strike, and with one thunderous blow felled the last blue wolf. Kago's levels surged after slicing through the wolves. He flopped onto the grass, stared at the sky while death's breath whispered close, and even pictured himself scribbling a suicide note. No amount of power in this world could fill that emptiness. A rustle in the bushes sent Kago leaping to his feet, muscles primed for another fight. At first he expected battle, but a closer look revealed something that snagged his gaze. The little puppy that came with the pack froze at his mother's lifeless body, sorrow clenching him for a moment as he stared. Then he spotted the hero and instantly lit up, darting around him with a wagging tail as if nothing had happened. He accepted the cold truth that the wolves would kill him. Their assault was coming. And he clutched the lone pup left from the whole pack to his chest. He stared down at the trembling puppy, mercy stopping his hand. He bowed to the dead she-wolf and vowed to raise the orphan himself. Then, bone-weary, he trudged back to the hut. Heart heavy and bone-tired, he collapsed onto the bed, cradled the puppy to his chest, and surrendered to sleep. Sarasa spotted the puppy and dove in to smother it with cuddles. The hero shouted the wolf cub wasn't for sale. She was clearly smitten. And when skinning 3 wolves proved brutal, he enlisted Sarasa and Juno to help, appraised the blue wolf's fang, and realized it could upgrade a weapon. He sold every scrap left of the wolves, pocketed a profit even after they'd tried to devour him, woke up, ran a skill assessment on the puppy, and discovered it was a rare ash wolf with fur nothing like ordinary members of its kind. The hero dared to hope that if the wolf cub grew up among people, he might not attack them. But he knew that if the grown beast ever harmed anyone, the responsibility and the task of killing him would fall to his hands. He feared that learning his parents' fate would spark a thirst for revenge, because in this world the strong devoured the weak, yet he vowed to do everything to raise him differently. He vowed to sew himself a cloak from ash wolf fur. He loved the color and counted on the wolf cub to scent him as one of its own. He sent his companions back to the city and found himself alone with the puppy, hunting for the perfect name. He named the pup Ash, and that scrappy little creature became the first being he could truly call family in this strange new world. The truth slamming into him like a boulder, a new life, brutal trials, crushing responsibility. And Kago understood a difficult path awaited him. The hero shouted for the puppy, desperate to stop him. Ash lunged for the chicken and had already scattered the seedlings. From that day on, there was no time for despair, and he vowed to Ash's parents he'd take on Ash's upbringing himself. Ash was caked in mud again today. The hero let out a weary sigh as he stared at the puppy and realized, if this kept up, the water would vanish fast. He remembered Margot had left some ingots and set out to see what he could make from them. After stubborn work, he coaxed them into a definite shape. After ages of forging, it was finally ready. A roaring hot bath. Relief crashed over the hero as he realized he could finally soak instead of scrubbing himself with icy water since he arrived in this world, and with the new transport system he could haul and stockpile all the water he wanted. Fired up, he exclaimed. A grin split the hero's face as he drank in the wide, peaceful space and shockingly fresh air. He usually bought water in the city, but hauling bulk supplies from the lake was far easier, and when he scanned the shore he spotted unfamiliar monsters nearby. As long as they didn't attack, there was nothing to fear. The hero spun to the puppy, grinning. They'd fetch water soon. Ash snapped rigid. Kigo's instincts screamed danger, and a sudden strike made him throw up a shield, the impact hurling him off his feet and slamming him into the barrels as he cursed and scrambled to recover. As he fought to catch his breath, the hero's eyes snapped open. A water monster. Ash charged, teeth sinking into the creature's back, and Kigo ripped out his bow, loosing a poisoned arrow that slammed into the monster's knee. An arrow slammed into the monster's knee and snapped its focus. Kigo pounced, his blade a lightning arc that lopped its head off. The moment it fell, a surge of energy flooded him and his level shot up again. And he knew the whole victory was only possible because of Ash. Kago cast appraisal on the fallen beast and discovered it was a Murnum, a water monster that commands water magic. So he wondered if that brutal strike had been a water spell, and knew if Ash hadn't sounded the alarm, he might not be standing here. Ash sprinted up with something clamped in his teeth, and when Kago checked it, he found a Murnum scale pulsing with water magic. perfect for enchanting gear or channeling water spells, so after hailing the wolf cub for saving him and fighting by his side, Keigo vowed this pup was no longer a pet, but his true partner. Keigo unleashed a sweeping symphony for Ash, the wolf cub hanging on every note, tail flicking with delight. That reaction hurled him deeper into the music, thrilled that his songs could spark joy even in this new world. Later they splashed and played in the bathtub for a while, and that warm little moment seared into Kago. Amid their hard life, that simple joy made the burden feel lighter. Keigo knew he had to toughen up to protect Ash, but he worried whether the wolf cub's diet was nutritious enough. He fed him herbs and eggs and still doubted they'd fuel proper growth. Ash was unbearably cute, but a wolf through and through, and just buying food wouldn't make him stronger. Keigo kept braving trips into town for jerky, each one laced with danger and pain, because in this new world, even everyday tasks could become a brutal challenge. Keigo vowed to avoid pointless battles. Today tore the veil. Monsters here could wield real magic, and defense alone wouldn't cut it. He had to find a way to strike back effectively. He wondered whether to hunt down a more powerful weapon to counter them, but the plan felt like too much trouble, so he shoved it aside for now, because if he was left alone, he'd have to rely only on himself. Keigo grabbed the meeting with Ash like destiny itself, desperate to believe it was meant for him. Deep down, he was certain he could shield the wolf cub and carve out a peaceful life no matter how brutal the world got. They could soak in hot baths whenever they wanted. But unease gnawed at Keiko. He sighed, stuck waiting for everything to dry, eyes flicking to the outfit he'd bought in town. Every time he wore it, he felt ripped from his world, nerves fraying his focus, though at least they'd fetched the water. Now, all that remained was... Today, Kigeko vowed to forge a weapon, launching in with roaring enthusiasm despite knowing the task would be brutal. After days hammering scraps into shape, he demanded multiple flawless trials to earn the right to touch the ash and wolf fangs, Juno's rare prize. And as he melted the iron ingots, Keigo winced at their cost, far pricier than the scraps he'd used before. Keigo finished his work, exhaled with relief, and stared at his creation with fierce pride. He wanted to show Ash, but Ash was busy chasing a butterfly and didn't even glance over. Keigo grinned, bent to perfect the handle, and a skill appraisal flashed up. Wolverine's sword. A blade forged from hard, precious iron and reinforced with the fang of an ash wolf, and Keigo couldn't help but think it sounded utterly impressive. Keigo burned with certainty that the weapon would protect Ash. Then he remembered the Murnum scale and the firestone he'd just found and decided to use them. Worked out a method. Crushed the scale and stone into a fine dust. Mixed the powder while praying it wouldn't explode. And when nothing detonated, he exhaled in relief. Now the real risk. He had to taste the concoction to trigger the appraisal. The instant Keigo tasted the powder, his tongue hummed and he cried out. He fired up appraisal and the truth slammed into him. Thunder Demon Powder, a charge that can lace weapons with lightning. Seeing fire and water together birthed lightning, he decided on the spot to test it on his Wolverine sword, carefully rubbing the powder along the blade, then fired appraisal again to inspect the result. He stared down his handiwork, Wolverine's Thunder Sword, a blade forged from solid precious iron, braced with an ash wolf fang and humming with lightning. Pride surged through him, and with one last move, wrapping the handle in insulating material so he could safely hold the weapon with bare hands, he finished, smiled at the sword, turned to Ash and declared it ready, then glanced at the wolf cub and found him fast asleep, not even waiting for the end. He almost reached for magic, then slammed the brakes. He had to harden his defense and sharpen his shooting first. With reliable mentors ready and a vow to protect Ash as both parent and partner, he refused to rely only on shots. The poison ingredients could run out, so he set off for Master Kai to master battle-tested defensive basics. The hero asked to keep the bow. When a firm yes came, he beamed and thanked them. Then Kai knocked an arrow, took deadly aim at the dummy, and released an arrow that flared with light before it even flew. Keigo's jaw dropped at the raw power pouring from his teacher. He'd known Kai was skilled, but never imagined this. Kai barked for him to try it, and Kei shot back a firm yes, dialed in his focus, and copied every movement to the letter, funneled every ounce of concentration into the shot, activated the ability, and roared the command. The system pinged that he'd gained the charged arrow skill. The arrow struck true, but Kiko already knew mastering it would demand brutal training. Kai grabbed Kago's attention and declared it was time to train defense, reminding him that facing an opponent meant more than raw strength. It demanded brutal courage. Kago accepted and charged. but his strike slammed far harder than he expected, and smashed into Kai's guard as Keiko's jaw dropped at how steel-strong it felt. So fired up, Kai ready to counterattack, and activated his toughness ability to see how much his defense could take from the next blow. The blow sent Keiko sprawling onto his back, but through the pain, a lightning-clear understanding struck. He'd unlocked the skill, toughness, and now only brutal training stood between him and perfection. Thinking of his teacher, he pushed himself up, charged forward, certain he'd succeed. Keiko had soaked up a flood of new skills today, but exhaustion bit harder with every minute. He knew to grow stronger he'd have to train even more, when Sarasa suddenly called his name and handed him the cloak he'd ordered. Her work was flawless, the quality top-notch, and as he glanced at Ash he wondered why the wolf cub cared so much, until it hit him. This cloak was a reminder of his parents, so he thanked Sarasa and vowed to take care of it. Sarasa jabbed at Keigo's crumbling shield and handed him a new one, and when he checked his gear he saw the truth. The thing was hopelessly unreliable. No surprise since it started as a barrel lid, so Keigo bought a proper shield from Sarasa and grabbed the cloak he'd ordered. Keigo watched Sarasa cradle Ash with impossible gentleness, a pang twisting in him as he realized how safe the pup looked in her arms. And, to his own surprise, he even envied his wolf cub. As if sensing his master's mood, Ash sprang from Sarasa, clambered into Kago, who smiled and pulled the puppy into a tight hug before they went home. Keigo slipped the cloak on again, still dazzled by how imposing it looked, spotted a handy flask pocket inside and remembered he had some Mornum scale dust left. Wondered if he could bind an element to the armor. Ran an experiment, completed the enchantment and watched the fabric bloom with a soft glow, then used his appraisal skill to confirm the result. Ash Wolf Cloak, fire resistance. Enchanted with the element of water, it now resisted fire. Keigo imbued his armor with water and watched fire recoil. Any advantage beat none, so he chose to enchant his shield too. The discovery cracked open new possibilities, and when he looked at Ash, he vowed to protect him, because the past few days had shown how weak he still was without his partner. Keigo drilled his marksmanship until training felt like his daily grind. Then Ash suddenly kicked up a racket and yanked his attention. Keigo spun to see a group of people in who knows what clothes. Keigo's eyes locked on Margot and Juno, both radiating fury, and his guard shot up. He turned to the man astride the lead horse and saw he was an aristocrat, flanked by hardened adventurers, and one question burned. What could such a man want from him? Guilt coiled in Keigo, but relief crashed over him when he realized his loved ones were unharmed. He bowed before the grave, murmured the words, pressed a single flower onto the stone, lowered his head and plunged into prayer. Keigo, distrust written all over his face, asked again about going to the forest dungeon. He flat out refused, insisting he was just a simple villager by the city and wouldn't risk himself. Wasn't the aristocrat with his retinue supposed to handle a few monsters? Margot, grinning, grabbed his face tight, making it obvious he wasn't thrilled either, but still couldn't say no. Keigo grimaced at the thought he'd end up supplying the party with potions. From the conversation he caught the nobleman's name, by rune, and started questioning whether the dungeon's monsters were really getting stronger and what use he'd be on this expedition. He rarely plunged deep into the forest, but duty dragged him in, so he decided to forage herbs to study, until something strange snagged his attention. The whole scene felt staged, like a performance, and he kept thinking he'd stepped into a movie. The dog-like monsters unleashed dark magic, maiming and slaughtering several mercenaries as the whole scene felt unreal, while the noblemen and their retinue stayed tucked in safety, barking orders and refusing to intervene, as if the mercenaries' deaths meant nothing to them. The hero slammed his shield over the mercenaries, turning their bodies into a living barrier and stopping the attack, while a familiar, bone-deep weariness about the world's cruel inequality that had haunted his old life flared back up, gnawing at him as he realized he couldn't change a thing, especially not with the battle exploding around him. He slammed the toughness skill on, his shield swelling with iron, barreled toward the monsters and bellowed to the mercenaries to run. When the beasts staggered and slowed, he seized that slim chance, screamed for everyone to flee immediately, spun on his heel and sprinted away with the surviving mercenaries pounding after him. Keigo vanquished a monster and felt his level spike. Studying the corpse, he realized what he'd been up against. Then a hellhound materialized, huge, lithe, its maw breathing fire, and after it spat a blast, it faltered and grew vulnerable. Margot watched, glum, muttering that going there was pure suicide. At that moment, Keigo snapped to the aristocrat closing in, shouting in fury, and Keigo, with a dry smirk, noted that he'd returned after all. The noble raged at them for fleeing, so he quelled his anger by showing regret and handing over some of his hard-earned coin, then left satisfied. Keigo realized this world harbored enemies as brutal as monsters, the nobles. Keigo loomed over the graves of the fallen mercenaries and felt a cold truth. After that brutal ordeal, only a handful were truly shaken. If his life depended on that nobleman. He knew he wouldn't mourn either, and the city's lure of safety and anonymity tugged at him, a tempting escape he'd already considered. City or countryside, an aristocratic monster could leap out at any moment, so the fear for his life clung to him, and he chose peace of mind over the lie of safety. He'd avoided people from the start, knew he looked eccentric, stopped caring what others thought. Then Margot stepped up, held out a small bag of gold coins, and lowering his head, asked for forgiveness. Keigo waved off Juno and Margot with a curt gesture. No apology needed. Then turned and offered a quick goodbye, refusing their gold. He just wanted to be alone and get home to Ash. But as he trudged back to his cart, exhaustion slammed into him, so he popped a few of the herbs he'd gathered, hoping for strength, only to feel power drain from his limbs with each bite until his body stopped responding, and he sank to the ground, stunned to find himself utterly paralyzed. Keigo jolted awake in a strange place with Ash curled warm on his chest. A sharp cry ripped out as he scanned the room and spotted Juno, Margot, and Sarasa nearby, and Sarasa's calm voice cut through the panic. The herbs he'd eaten were poisonous. That's why he'd lost consciousness. Guilt hit him like a fist, and he immediately apologized to Juno and Margot for making them carry him while they were exhausted after he'd collapsed. Keigo crashed into about 6 hours of sleep while Juno, Margot, and Sarasa watched over Ash and Renante. And when guilt slammed him once again, he'd caused trouble for everyone, as he thanked Sarasa for the tea she'd brought to his bedside. Keigo smiled warmly, stunned by how incredibly kind they all were. Sarasa of Sanjago snapped awake, stunned to realize he'd been holed up in an inn the whole time. He thanked his friends and vowed to repay them, then vaulted into his cart and rode for home, swearing he'd avoid the forest. Its monsters, hellhounds among them, bristled with fury after their last clash, and Keigo didn't know when he'd be ready to face them, but he knew the showdown would come. Keigo snatched up the herb he'd eaten earlier, decided to investigate, and fired his appraisal skill. The readout revealed a green anesthetic herb with brutal numbing power and no antidote. He couldn't deny the name fit its effects. Keigo knocked the prey out with an anesthetic potion, but refused to start carving until the poison flushed from his veins. He lashed the carcass to a tree branch, spotted a goblin nearby, saw a perfect chance for practice and extra defense, and pounced, sitting on the ground to bait it, firing up Stronghold before every strike and gulping recovery potions after his blows, while the goblin slowly ran out of steam and weakened. The goblin bolted and Keigo let him go. He never chased a retreating foe, so he wrapped his shield with a satisfied grin, feeling strength surge through him. Then, puzzled that the wolves hadn't attacked lately, he glanced at Ash dozing sweetly on a tree stump, smiled, and stroked him, savoring the rare calm. Keigo cracked a grin. He'd finally finished the fire daggers. With a few wares left to sell and a bundle of dried venison packed, he patted Ash and declared with a warm smile that he'd take him to the city as thanks. Keigo shoved the fire daggers into Margot's hands, pocketed the payment, and blinked at him in puzzled silence. Margot rose without a sound, stepped to the cart and jabbed at something in the pile, and Keigo, following the point, said it was meant to be sold to Sarasa. Margot said cool as ice he'd buy everything at once and maybe sell it to Sarasa, which made Keigo wonder if Margot planned to scoop up his goods wholesale and flip them. But Keigo shrugged and sealed the deal, jabbed a finger at the keg he'd hauled in to announce he had booze in stock, and watched Margot's face split into a wide, delighted smile at the unexpected bonus. Keigo frowned. Margot didn't strike him as the sort who'd responsibly close the store so casually, but he couldn't be sure. His attention snapped to Juno when she stepped up and asked Margot something, and he realized they were planning to invite Sarasa too so they could all take a day off together. With the table set and everyone sipping their drinks, Sarasa suddenly whipped out a chicken and called for skewers. Keigo sprang into action, slicing meat and vegetables with sharp, steady strokes and threading them onto sticks. Then the grill began to sizzle, and that smoky, mouth-watering smell swept the room and made everyone ravenous. He'd been through hell since he came to this world. Death hovered at his shoulder, but he still flashed a confident grin, just like the three sitting next to him. Confidence? Keigo turned the word over in his head, and when Ash reached for the food, he pressed a strip of dried venison into his hand. He felt safe now, and that was enough. Kigo craned his neck, marveling at a sky unbroken by high-rises. Stars scattered like confetti and the moon splashed the world with bright silver light. He stretched as a sharp ache shot through every muscle. Chalked it up to sleeping in the carriage last night. Glanced at Ash to find him perfectly fine. Grinned and ran his hand through that fluffy fur while declaring him impossibly cute. Thought to fetch water for a bath before they went home. Pitched the idea to Ash, who answered with a joyful bark. Kego nodded and, moving briskly, soon had enough water and savored that everything was ready. Kigo declared everything ready and urged Ash to set off. Before they could move, a low growl rolled out, and following his loyal companion's fixed stare, he expected Murnum. Sure enough, Murnum stood on a large rock watching a massive snake that had already spotted him, but hadn't yet noticed Kigo or Ash. Kego's heart slammed with alarm. Murnum looked like a babe beside that towering monster. He dropped onto Ash and clamped a hand over his mouth to stop any slip. Danger buzzing in his veins drove him to shovel his things together and bolt for home, until a weird sound sliced the air and pinned him frozen. The monster hunched, its belly churning with a sickening gurgle as it brewed a caustic venom, then spat a sizzling stream straight at Murnum. The poison burned through his scales and he let out a piercing squeal. Kigo vaulted into the cart and barked, "Retreat!" yanking the reins and spurring his horse into a blistering gallop to tear out of the danger zone. He barely registered the bath he'd filled sliding away and shoved the thought aside. Not the time. Locked inside the hut and buried under a heap of hay, Kego sucked in ragged breaths, fighting the fear that clutched his throat. His hands shook, his heart hammered in his chest. Tears streaked his cheeks, and one question kept slamming through his mind. What should he do now? Kiko swore that whatever monster stood against the RPG hero, the hero would always prevail. But Kiko was just a humble farmer who couldn't face that beast alone. So he had one option: slip out of his hut, peering to make sure the monster wasn't on his heels, then sprint to the guild, snatch a board and chalk and scrawl a rough picture of a massive snake with a Mornum looming before it. When he finished, he spun and asked the guild if anyone knew what kind of creature it was. Kego's pulse spiked. If that creature really was a snake, he had to trust others and pray someone would slay the monster. An announcement boomed. A job to tame a snake. 5 gold coins. He vowed not to tackle anything he couldn't handle alone, because survival depended on it. Life was worth more than pointless gambles, so he chose to stick to what he could do and dodge needless risks. A couple of days later, Kigo sagged with exhaustion. Digging the trench had wiped him out, but he clung to the thought that even this tiny step beat doing nothing. Then luck struck. A crew of veteran adventurers answered his ad, and they didn't just take the job, they somehow tracked down his missing bathtub. Kigo was sure turning to the adventurers was the right call in a mess like this. He wouldn't let cockatrices or hellhounds spill from the forest and ravage his home, so he vowed to lean on adventurers to guard it. Then he remembered he'd gone ages without going to the water, told Ash he was going to drain the bathtub, but when the dog started acting strange, he froze and, voice tight, asked warily what was wrong. The moment Kego threw out his question, Ash bolted and Murnum exploded from the water. Panic clawed at Kego's chest for a heartbeat, then relief washed over him when he recognized the face, only Murnum. Kego didn't want to fight, but with an opponent in front of him and a perfect chance to test an idea, he squinted, drew the bowstring, and sent an anesthetic arrow straight into Murnum's shoulder. The arrow slammed into the Murnum's shoulder and it crumpled, strength draining away. Kago darted forward and, with one precise, merciless blow, lopped its head off. Inspecting the corpse, he discovered that despite its strange shape, its insides matched a fish's, and a fleeting thought crossed his mind. Could it be eaten? Not now. First, he had to start skinning Manama Hahiblan. Murnem parts were hot commodities for potion makers, so Kego pressed her to teach him how to skin monsters properly to stop screwing up, even flirting with the idea of tasting ingredients to judge their properties until he remembered the anesthetic wouldn't fully wear off for 6 hours. And when a fresh batch of Murnum's scales landed, it yanked him back to his blacksmithing roots as he eyed his enchanted daggers, already laced with fire and perfect for survival, and wondered, what if he enchanted the dagger with a water effect? Kego activated his appraisal skill and watched the enchanted dagger drip tiny beads of water from its tip. He frowned. At first it seemed like ordinary water. Then a spark of inspiration hit. Plunge the blade into a flask to collect pure drinking water. A brilliantly handy everyday trick, even if it adds nothing to your combat arsenal. Kiko squinted at the barrel, wondering how long it would take to fill so the fields could be irrigated and the livestock watered, knowing it would gulp gallons but thrilled that a new source had appeared, spotting the chance to crank out more daggers for sale and his own use, and sketching a plan in his head, luxuriating in the warm bath and already craving the next refill. But his rest was short-lived. It was time to get cooking. Kigo roasted the Myrna meat over coals just in case, though it burst with flavor raw. No white wine was on hand, but a fruity ale matched it perfectly. The flesh tasted like white fish, familiar yet undeniably local to this world. Scanning the pond, he found a menagerie of animals and fish, a treasure trove of new tasty ingredients. Then he jerked back. This was the snake's hunting ground, and survival meant keeping far away. Kigo huffed, realizing he was arguing with himself again. But money mattered more. We needed cash to place another order with the Adventurers Guild, so he turned to Ash and said he'd go with him to the city the next day to sell the new daggers. He was hooked on the water dagger that sprayed water, a perfect everyday tool, and planned to sell 2 to Sarasa and 2 to Margot. Yet the moment he said it, Margot yelled he'd take all 4, igniting a fierce fight between Margot and Sarasa as both shoved Kigo to sell the daggers to them. Ash barked like a gavel and shut the fight down. Margot won this round, and strangely their squabbles always soothed the air. Kigo noticed Juno off to the side, sorrow carved into his face, and couldn't shake the question of what was gnawing at him. Kigo cradled Ash and vowed he'd come back for him once his business was done. But memories slammed him to his trading company days. He met foreigners all the time, yet never closed the distance. A language canyon made every exchange stiff and strained, and even after finding himself in this world, fear still kept him from getting close to anyone. In this world, bonds bloomed from only a few words, so Kago never bothered learning new expressions. His rough phrases landed anyway, people understood, and he smiled, proud of the connections he'd forged. Kago inspected the item Margot had given him and discovered hellhound claws could be used in blacksmithing, their powdered dust begging to be enchanted with fire resistance and fire charms, so he holed up at home for a few days and then completed his work, forging a sort of hellfire and a fist shield from those hellhound materials, the shield bristling with high fire resistance and ready to shrug off flame attacks. Kago drenched his shield in firewards and bolted metal plates to it. Sure he could face the hellhound. He tested his new sword with a roaring swing that spat a tiny firestorm and shredded the chair to splinters. Staring at the smoking wreck, he felt the blade's brutal power. Then Ash exploded into frantic barking. Kago snapped to alert and saw his prey fallen into the trap, and if not for his faithful companion, he'd have missed it. Kigo realized traps laced with paralyzing poison were snaring animals more and more. Deciding the rabbit could be smoked later, he set to work on the venison and boar that needed cooking right away, glanced away with satisfaction at the nearly full bath. This day earned a hot soak and real rest, and later, as he savored the cooked venison, he couldn't help but marvel at how amazing it tasted. Kiko savored the first real taste of a carefree life. He sliced a chunk of venison, pressed it into Ash's hand, and watched him devour it with pure pleasure. Back in his old world, he'd often wondered if he could have become a farmer and lived quietly, and now it actually felt possible if not for the looming threat of nobles and monsters. A life of simple pleasures and a cozy home suddenly looking perfect, until his thoughts snapped when he saw Margot and Juno striding toward him, and guessed they were out hunting because the monsters had been growing fiercer lately. Kiko braced to be left behind, then saw Margot and Juno plotting to go, so he stopped Juno and thrust potions into their hands. Sure, those vials would help his friends more now, and Juno accepted them with a grateful nod. Kago noticed Margot hadn't gone with Juno and wondered why. Before he could ask, she wordlessly peeled off her clothes and commandeered the bathroom, forcing him to sigh as his ashbath plans evaporated. So he shrugged it off, and then froze at a heap of exotic ingredients she'd hauled in, when, to his surprise, she announced she was giving them all away. Suspicious she was trying to bribe him to do whatever she wanted in his house. He hesitated, weighed their value, thanked her, she nodded, and if that was the deal, he'd gladly take everything. Kigo told Margot he was heading out to pick herbs, and Margot tagged along at once, Margot's steady presence calming Kigo's restless soul. While they gathered plants, Margot suddenly froze and jabbed to the side. Kigo followed his gaze and stared at a band of strange monsters. Margot barked for Kigo to shoot them with his bow. Kigo shot back an okay to show he understood. And though Kigo had never seen creatures like those, Margot stayed unfazed. Maybe he'd met them before. Fresh from a fight that nudged his strength up, Kigo knelt over the fallen and saw a cobalt warrior and a gray bear, serious but beatable foes. then came home to find Margot hogging the bathroom, laughing loudly and clearly enjoying the rest. He just shook his head, amazed at her ease, and let her rest as long as she wanted. After a clean kill, Kigo and Margot hauled away prized ingredients from the slain monsters. Margot decided to butcher the carcasses back in the city. Kigo thanked her and sent his companion on her way, then felt a quiet shock at how easily he'd upended his solitary routine. Though he loved being alone, he'd made quite a few friends lately. An odd turn from his trading company days when conversations were cold business. These new ties felt warmer, more real, and as that settled, his gaze landed on the oil lamp. Kigo had often noticed the town's oil lamps burned on demon cores seized from defeated monsters, and staring at one bright glow, he replayed how they'd seized a similar core on their last raid. The light stole his breath, and he caught himself marveling while Ash slept soundly, curled warm against his arm. So Kigo smoothed the dog's fur, wished him good night in his head, and let himself relax. Kigo dropped into his chair and tore into his notes, forging his own encyclopedia of the world, jotting that anyone without a guide could build one, and that a pocket copy would be priceless in the city. He silently thanked Margot for the supplies and help and kept working. Life in Lancaster was creeping back toward normal, but a dark threat still hovered, reminding him the peace might be fleeting. Kigo slammed toughness into place, blunting Murnum's blow and nudging the monster back a step. At the perfect instant, he unleashed Hellfire Roar. Nothing. The blade's magic failed, so he drove a raw, straight strike that only shoved Murnum back again. Kigo activated his strike skill and cut the Murnum down with one razor-precise move. Fighting them felt easier as he pieced together attribute interactions. Water attacks sliced through fireproof armor, while fire attacks collapsed against water. He avoided needless fights, but mastering the world's attribute laws was vital, so he launched more experiments on water element Murnums to crack the mechanics and refill his stock of prize scales and meat, and today's haul was especially generous. After snapping the cart shut, Kigo froze at a strange hiss, spun and saw the serpent slithering relentlessly toward him, realized the danger, vaulted into the cart without hesitation, and barked for his horse to gallop away. Ash unleashed a non-stop barrage of barks at the snake, trying to scare it off. Kigo decided the dog shouldn't rile the dangerous creature and beckoned Ash closer to him to avoid the threat. Once home, he dove into the hut and slammed the door shut. Huddled in the hut, Kigo kept silently repeating that he'd made a mistake. His recent wins over the Murnums had lulled him into carelessness, and he'd completely forgotten the far deadlier serpent slithering nearby. He prayed the beast wouldn't find his hiding place or show up at his home, and those gnawing thoughts and a rising, uncontrollable terror stole his sleep all night. Kigo barreled back into the Adventurers Guild and cranked up the reward for taming the serpent. As he rewrote the notice, a sharp idea struck him. Fortify the area and plant more traps around the house. He'd already sent a request to destroy the beast, but that didn't feel like enough. What else could he do to protect himself? Kigo boiled Gibble venom with the cockatrix poison glands Margot had handed him, but when it came time to test the brew, doubt coiled in his gut. Terrified yet desperate to know, he forced down a sip and immediately downed the antidote he'd prepped, but it only blunted the hit. Strength bled from his limbs. He crumpled to the floor, unable to stand, and Ash, seeing his master fall, barked frantically, desperate to pull him back to his feet. Kigo downed another dose of the antidote, fought the weakness clawing at him, and finally snapped to. After checking himself, he realized he'd been given the poison donor, so toxic a single drop could kill him. And his breath hitched as he yanked the pacing Ash into a fierce hug to calm him, stroked his faithful companion's fur, and whispered a quiet apology for making him worry. Kigo prayed the poison would actually repel the snake, his voice raw with a single plea. Let it work, because, imperfect as his plans were, he'd thrown everything at it, laid traps, forged medicines, and plotted countermeasures. He rubbed his forehead to steady his thoughts, his head still reeling from testing the toxin, and could only hope the serpent never slithered to his home. After a night hollowed out by fear, Kigo sagged with exhaustion and his limbs refused him, but he forced himself upright. Dawn had come and Ash needed care. As he stepped to feed the dog, it exploded into a deafening bark that knotted his stomach. A cold certainty hit him, so he snatched up his weapon, muscles coiling as he strained to catch sounds around them, dread clutching his movements while duty drove him to check what was wrong. Kigo slammed to a halt at the snake's sight. Salvation felt impossible. His heart hammered, his legs fused to the earth. The thought of running flared, then collapsed. He'd already whispered goodbye to life and braced to bolt when suddenly, A band of adventurers burst into view before Kigo and Ash, planting themselves between the two and the serpent. Without a second's hesitation, the fighters hurled spells and slashed at the beast, each blow rattling the earth and magic sparking in the air as the serpent hissed and lunged at them. Keigo's shock glued him to the spot, eyes locked on the battle raging before him. He knew this was his only shot at salvation, but his limbs betrayed him as fear rooted him to the ground. Ash pinned his ears back and issued a low, defiant growl, refusing to leave his master's side. Kiko crumpled to one knee, clutching Ash to his chest as his mind scrambled through the battle's chaos. Flashes of magic and the dull thud of weapons on the snake's scaly plates only muddled him more. He knew he didn't belong and would be useless, so he decided to leave it to the adventurers. But right then, the snake's body tensed. Steam hissed from its jaws, and it readied a poisonous spit that would dissolve anything alive. The close combat fighter slammed up a shield just in time, taking the brunt of the serpent's venomous spit as steam hissed over his barrier, yet the defense held, and he spun to the two female mages who had come with him and shouted for support. They answered instantly, fingers flying to weave spells, while the snake, as if sensing the threat, coiled its massive bulk back into position for the next strike. The mages poured every ounce of power into one breath and, in perfect unison, unleashed a spell that ripped into a roaring fire tornado. Flames shot skyward, engulfed the serpent's colossal body. Its scales blackened and flesh blistered before collapsing into dust. The heat so searing, Kigo instinctively slapped a hand over his face, and when the inferno finally died, there was no trace of the beast, only charred shards of earth where it had stood. The adventurers stood breathless and triumphant, checking their win and praising how flawlessly they'd coordinated and crushed the job. Kigo, still reeling, thanked them, and knew calling the guild had been the right move, and as he watched his saviors depart, he marveled at how they had charged the deadly creature without hesitation and, moving as one, defeated it. Kago realized he'd just seen perfect cooperation and strength he didn't yet have. After nights without rest, Keigo finally collapsed into sleep, and when he woke and stepped outside the wreckage, convinced him this wasn't a nightmare but brutal reality. Chaos reigned around him. Scars from the snake fight were scrawled everywhere. Every weapon and trap he'd prepared had proven useless against that monstrous foe. The cold truth that he'd come inches from death stole his breath, yet he was alive. And the fact that he and Ash had survived was everything, as Keigo scanned the destruction and replayed the night in his head. Then a voice suddenly called out to him. Margot and Juno burst in from the city. Having heard from the guild about a snake sighting, they looked frantic and had raced here for Kago. He forced a calm smile, told them he was fine and thanked them. But before his words finished, they barreled forward and crushed him in a grateful hug, relief pouring from their movements while Kago froze for a heartbeat, then let out a long breath and melted into the embrace, stunned at how good it felt to know someone truly cared. Margot melted into the bath, letting the warm water wrap her, while Kigo poured a drink for Juno, who accepted it with a grateful nod. They'd broken his quiet, but he surprised himself by deciding it wasn't so bad. Their presence felt cozy and familiar, and Kigo eased down beside him, looked up, and let the endless sweep of stars above swallow him. Named Ash by his owner, this second-level wolf cub grew at a painfully slow rate because his species was so rare, and he glued himself to his master, tailing him non-stop and, even asleep, curling at his master's feet, convinced that's the only place that felt truly safe and comfortable. Ash craved meat above everything, especially the mouth-watering cuts his master handed him, and he savored every bite. The master also owned a horse named Rosianta, and a daft chicken Ash wasn't allowed to eat. Rosianta only grazed on fresh grass while that silly hen loved worms. So one day Ash tried to help by bringing her wriggling earthworms, but the master snapped he mustn't. Rules were rules. And obedient Ash stepped back. Ash shadowed his master, every day a new adventure. Where would they go today? Until one day a terrible monster attacked the master. Without thinking, Ash let loose a savage bark to scare it off, a menacing roar that chased the enemy away, and when his master stroked him, Ash felt like the happiest wolf cub in the world. An older man and a young woman erupted into a fight over Keigo's attention, and Ash snapped, unleashing a sharp bark to break them up. Yet the girl lunged instead, snatching the wolf cub into a crushing hug that nearly smothered him as he whimpered like he was begging for mercy. While Keigo watched with a strange, unreadable look Ash couldn't make sense of. Ash lived to sing. One day he and his owner sat in the bathtub belting a goofy tadadan, soaking up the moment. The wolf cub's heart soared when he chimed in with Kago, and he tore after anything thrown. But when his owner tossed a bone, he erupted into pure ecstatic play, convinced it was the best game in the world. Ash trotted back with the bone, and Kigo patted him like always. Heaven. Yet Kigo could be so stupid. The wolf spotted his empty water bowl, raced to wake his owner and got no reaction, so Ash growled, yelped, and started jumping on the bed, barking, "Get up! How can you sleep with no water, very stupid owner?" The room blazed like a furnace, so stifling Ash could barely stand, and he'd already warned Kago it was dangerous. But collapsing wasn't an option. He had to shield his master until he woke. Ash's instincts prickled. Something long and massive lurked in the dark, so he dared it. "Come on, come out!" A weary growl rumbled from the wolf as he kept his eyes locked on the shadow shifting in the corner. He'd always warned his master of looming danger no matter how terrifying, and this time would be no different. He'd protect Kago. He'd protect Rosianta. The creature snapped forward, but Ash planted himself and refused to back down. Who thought a menacing glare would scare him? Fools. Ash was not so easy to stop. Even after everything, his owner shone as the kindest soul alive, and Ash swore he'd shadow him forever, trailing wherever he roamed. Ash, the Ash Wolf, his owner's loyal partner and unbreakable protector. That day, Okudo strode through the forest flanked and guarded by Margot and Juno, two battle-hardened fighters, and with Ash, a faithful dog at their heels, they combed the deep woods for medicinal herbs. Had Okuda been alone, he wouldn't have dared push that deep into the forest. Relief crashed over him when he realized trusted comrades were right beside him. Margot barked, "Target's here, keep moving." Moments later, they thundered into battle and tore the monster apart with no serious losses, and he admitted the fight was far easier than he'd expected. Victory came easily to them. Margot spotted an enemy creeping up behind him and screamed a warning. Before he could dodge, Okuda was slammed by a surprise strike that sent him sprawling, and almost immediately colossal new monsters, bigger than the first, burst onto the battlefield, where he blurted in stunned disbelief, "A cockatrice?" He watched the group snap into a new formation to meet the threat. This time he'd take the front with a shield and hold the enemy back. When the cockatrice's eyes flared an eerie light, alarm jolted through him. He knew petrification was coming, so he activated his defensive ability, Fortress, and braced to withstand the stone onslaught. Cold numbness crept into Okuda's arm. He forced his breath steady and told himself to stay calm and take the potion like he always did. Then Margot lunged in and pressed the vial into his hand just in time as the elixir flooded warmth back through his limb. He swallowed it and thanked her, relief flooding him. Nearby, Ash barked a fierce rally to fire everyone up, praised the dog, then gave the signal to launch the counterattack. Margot and Juno leapt forward in perfect unison to back him. They converged and unleashed a thunderous combined strike that shattered the enemy, every move synced to perfection. After the battle, the system screamed a notification. The character rocketed from level 12 to 13, and every stat surged. Health leapt from 26 to 28, magical energy shot from 16 to 27, vitality climbed from 19 to 21, strength surged from 25 to 27, intelligence edged up from 76 to 77, agility sprang from 31 to 33, speed raced from 25 to 27. Power exploded inside Okuda. He knew he was stronger than before and had just taken a huge step forward. A brutal truth slammed into him. Raw strength wasn't enough. What truly mattered were reliable comrades standing at his side. They nailed the mission and marched back into the city intact. No one lost. Sarasa, a woman among them, stepped straight up to Okuda, and a cold memory hit him. The last time he'd seen her was before the snake's brutal attack on his home. He exhaled, stunned. After everything he'd been through, he was fine. A fierce, private satisfaction surged through him, stealing his words. He craved the quiet safety of ordinary days. But since he landed in this world, every sunrise slammed into him with a brand new challenge. Back then, he worked at a company and was swallowed whole by work, tearing through task after task until nothing else mattered. After parting with his colleagues, silence slammed into him, and a hollow loneliness gnawed at his chest. He figured his former comrades were probably tearing it up, living life to the fullest. Selfish thoughts clawed at him, yet he admitted to himself he craved a calm, measured life, and beneath it all a furious hunger to be truly free pounded in his chest. People whispered that even veteran adventurers crumble before a snake like that. And he swallowed his pride, admitting a dragon's attack would probably finish him. He vowed to get stronger and survive come hell or high water. Magic beckoned as his best shot at staying alive. He joked he'd always wielded mighty powers, but the truth was he didn't, and he believed life was merciless and never forgave mistakes. Just recently, it hit him. He was a prodigy in alchemy and a master at the forge. He alone brewed potions and hammered weapons that outclassed everyone. Margot, a veteran craftswoman, couldn't replicate a single one. He had no fire magic, but his blazing sword unleashed the same inferno. He couldn't cast healing spells, so he brewed potions that restored health and purged negative conditions. That result came entirely from his special appraisal skill. He swallowed his pride. He'd badly underestimated it. And when he plunged into alchemy and blacksmithing, he realized it could be his path to success. Whatever path he chose, it all boiled down to relentless grind and unyielding persistence. That thought sank in, and sleep claimed him. He snapped awake as realization slammed into him. He had one more weapon, a bow. Later, he stormed into practice to sharpen his bow skills, and mid-lesson, he turned to Master Kai and thanked him for his unwavering support and fierce training. Kai barked an order to pierce, drew his bow in one smooth motion, and unleashed a flawless shot to show him. Okuda realized the skill supercharged arrows' penetrating force, turning each shot into a crushing blow, just the kind of power to fell monsters that shrugged off magic. Power surged through him, but he knew lethal hidden predators still stalked the world. One dropped guard and his life would be forfeit. Kai pivoted to Okuda and signaled it was his shot. Okuda nodded, calm as a statue, planted himself in a rock-solid stance, locked his focus, steeled his breath, and willed the shot to pierce the target. A cold calculation snapped into place. Rather than gamble his life in sword duels, he'd train as an archer, strike from distance and survive. Learning magic from scratch would take forever and break him. So archery was the faster, surer path, and he vowed to pour every ounce of effort into mastering the bow. The system roared its confirmation. Kigo Okuda had mastered piercing shot, and knowing a first-try hit was nearly impossible, he nodded in quiet thanks for the experience and strode away. He barreled up to Dan and declared he would file a formal request to become his subordinate. Then a sudden flash hit him. Requests like that were shockingly common. He usually springs into action the moment he spots especially powerful monsters circling near his home. He stared at his old bow, scarred, string frayed, its strength bled out, and stormed into the gun shop. Relief roared through Okuda when he landed a new bow. Then he spotted Margot approaching with a grin and frantically tried to figure out what exactly he was trying to express. Unease slammed into Okuda as he pleaded in his head for Margot not to act rashly. Shutting the shop in broad daylight was a terrible move, and drinking every day would be downright reckless. He urged him in a low, insistent voice to abandon the idea, and inwardly he registered that Margot stood out with a rare carelessness none of the others shared. He sealed the final, intricate steps to brew petrifying sand while watching the cockatrice's eye dry. Sighed in relief as the system chimed. He'd forged a new weapon. A petrifying arrow that turns any target it hits to stone. Okuda realized he could already forge poison and paralysis arrows and resolved to stow them apart from his hunting shafts to prevent a deadly mistake. Just then Ash, his dog, barked sharp and hauled his attention back. Okuda snapped to attention and scanned for the source of the commotion. He went rigid when the nobles drew near, feeling the hot press of staring eyes settle on him. Beirun strode over, cut off any escape, and barked that Okuda had to go with them. Okuda's mind slammed into overdrive as he scrambled to figure out if they really meant it. He dropped into a low, respectful bow and apologized, pledging to accept his place beneath them. They still weren't satisfied. He slid a coin across in absolute silence to seal the exchange, and the nobles swept out without uttering a single word. Okuda drew a ragged breath, registered that he'd just dodged a dangerous mess and walked away unscathed, and felt a surge of relief that neither Margot nor Juno were around this time. He didn't want them to see this clash. He glanced back at the retreating adventurers, and his chest tightened with pity. Exhausted, joyless, wished them a safe return, then snapped the sympathy away and reminded himself they had nothing to do with him. Relief surged. His supplies were replenished, but the herbs he'd dragged from the forest still needed checking. He dreaded testing them for poison, yet he forced himself to do it. Just then the noise outside yanked his attention. He looked out and spotted the nobles at his home once more. Okuda couldn't yet grasp what was unfolding, but his gaze froze when he took in the aftermath. Petrification had spilled outward, turning a vast swath to stone. Panic ripped through him as he frantically hunted the Peruna potion and, blessedly, found it almost immediately. Surveying the wreckage, he realized the people had been ravaged by a cockatrice attack. Okuda scanned the wounded strewn before him, and relief crashed through him. None of them had been killed. The adventurers failed to reach the dungeon again. He stood among the wounded, irritation coiling in him as he swallowed his words. Outraged they'd trashed his turf once more. A thought slammed into him. His barn wasn't meant to be a field hospital. A brutal clarity slammed into him. The nobleman was the true culprit and had to be held accountable. Okuda clenched his teeth and vowed that next time he'd collect compensation from him without fail. Irritation flared. He seethed inwardly and branded the nobleman an idiot. He refused to abandon the victims, handing out refreshments as the grateful adventurers flooded him with thanks. The nobleman shoved them onward, impatience snapping off him while Okuda silently prayed they'd never return. When the commotion finally died, he stared, wondering what happened to the nobleman's horse, then let out a long, relieved breath. Alone at last, he could get back to his business in peace. Byron sprang from a noble, respected house that had rooted itself in Leicester for generations, its long, rich, glorious lineage known to nearly every soul in the city. Not a soul on Leicester's streets escaped the echo of the famous name Byron. It seared itself into the city's collective mind. Panic gripped the city as monster attacks grew more frequent. He blamed a dungeon in the nearby forest overflowing with deadly creatures, and warned that its spillover had sharply increased the number of monsters around the city. When Beirun realized his past demanded action, responsibility crashed down on him like a boulder. He swore a noble's duty was to shield his hometown, keep the peace, and prove his courage. So he personally handpicked a band of adventurers and stormed the forest dungeon to purge it of every threat. He watched in disbelief as the expedition collapsed before it even began. His companions, hopelessly unready for battle, froze. And when a single cockatrice, ordinary but still dangerous, showed up, the so-called adventurers screamed and scattered in all directions. Melty, the horse he adored and his faithful companion, was safely returned to him unscathed, kept out of the monster's path so she wouldn't be harmed or killed. After the unsuccessful campaign, Beirun staggered back to his chambers, and a sudden, crushing sadness slammed into him, swallowing him whole. For 3 days and 3 nights his pillow stayed sodden with tears, a mute testament to the torment in his mind. He pictured his favorite and begged her to wait for him, vowing he'd restore her to her former self no matter what path he had to blaze or how many gold coins it cost. Beirun burned that his men must toil ceaselessly to raise their master's honor, branded neglect a sacred offense demanding severe punishment, and when the companions he chose failed him, tarnished his good name, and tried to excuse themselves, he immediately had them locked up for a week, seeing the punishment as part of the duties his noble birth required. Beirun insisted noblemen must personally mete out justice to anyone who failed him, and he warned you'd better think twice before daring to cross him. Outside the city, a strange man lived like a ghost, reclusive and unlike anyone else, and Byron swore he knew exactly where he belonged in society. He saw Byron frozen solid, barreled to his side and healed him. Unlike everyone else, this man wasn't just reliable, he was truly indispensable. The man called the meat kunsei. Byron's first bite detonated on his tongue, crowning it the most delicious dish he'd ever tasted. A surge of admiration hit him, and he vowed that next time he'd win this man as a loyal subordinate and charge into the dungeon at his side. All for his honor, because he saw himself as the land's hero whose name must echo everywhere. He braced for the coming battle in his mind and vowed to hunt the monsters down. A roaring laugh, blazing with resolve, split the air as he hurled the name Melty from his throat, dripping with passion. Dan, one of the guild's workers, had been drowning in work these past few days. Dangerous creatures swarmed the city's edges, cockatrice, snakes, and other monsters prowling and menacing the streets, and Dan was certain it all spilled from the nearby dungeon bursting at the seams. He felt it in his bones. Unless he acted decisively, devastation would sweep the city's residents and surrounding areas. Warning signs were already flashing and the economy was visibly sliding into decline. The guild threw its support behind daring adventurers, arming them to slay rampaging monsters and protect terrified civilians. And these heroes risked their lives every day to pull others back from the brink. A cold truth hit Dan. Nobody would dive into that kind of heroism for free. Only a fool would sign up for those risks without proper pay. He burned to reward the brave properly, but his hands were tied. The guild's coffers were thin, and the customers' payments were measly. He hammered that the whole mess hinged on a powerful local noble. It turned out to be Beirun, and Dan insisted the man was stingy to the bone. As the city teetered on the brink and its defenders cried out for support, Beirun relentlessly tore into the guild's budget. Dan was certain that cranking up quest rewards would pull in tougher adventurers, hungry to charge into battle against monsters. Crush the monsters and markets will roar back to life, clearing the way for a proper tax system. As Dan noted, the nobleman at Rune's side couldn't even grasp the barest basics. His behavior screamed absurdity, and he became a non-stop headache for everyone around him. Dan raced to the guildmaster for advice, only to be handed paltry coin, pocket change that didn't even come close to the scale of the threats. Against this tense backdrop, a mysterious man named Kago appeared. Okuda, an adventurer by trade who moved unlike anyone else. He issued his own contracts and dangled jaw-dropping bounties, even for hunting monstrous, lethal beasts, and the pay wiped away the danger while Dan swelled with pure gratitude. Dan swore Kago belonged to the same pack as Margot, Juno, and Sarasa. He saw them together so often it was obvious, and he guessed Kago padded his adventurer's pay by hawking all kinds of goods, though that was just a hunch. He shrugged off where the money came from. Only one thing mattered. Kago kept the guild flush with steady, generous payments for every order. So Dan vowed to watch the strange man's every move and treasure that support. After the showdown with that arrogant nobleman, Okuda rejoined the comrades he'd shared countless trials and small moments with, and once they confirmed he was unscathed, they agreed a celebration was in order to blast away the tension and taste life again. He nearly choked on his drink as Sarasa, far from refusing, raised her glass with fierce confidence, knocked back round after round, and proved she could endure and savor every sip. As laughter roared around them, his comrades pressed him to tell what had happened with that nobleman, and how it had ended. And Okuda, flustered and stumbling for words, admitted he'd given the man the money, and, voice strained, begged them not to bother him anymore, not to interfere in his life, and to leave him alone. He scrambled explanations in a mangled local tongue he barely mastered, flinging wild gestures and pleading expressions to stand in for missing words. Yet he couldn't tell if anyone truly understood him. He beamed, certain they'd loved it. Their faces, laughter, and every reaction screamed that the story had come alive. That night, usually wrapped in silence, suddenly erupted into noise, laughter, and wild, unexpected moments. Surprisingly for him, it wasn't bad at all. It felt refreshingly alive. Accepting the day was finished and nothing could be changed. Okuda bid everyone good night and finally laid his past to rest inside him. The next morning, as the first sunbeams pierced the window, he sheepishly handed his comrades water and warned them to be careful, last night's libations still sharp in his mind. When the room emptied, he realized he'd drunk a ton but felt weirdly euphoric. His body, once weak to alcohol, had toughened after sharpening his appraisal skill and non-stop poison experiments, raising his resistance to harmful effects. A flash hit him. The grass he'd just found in the forest, untested, and from its look and what he'd seen before he expected nothing good and braced for a nasty effect. But he steeled himself and ran a small experiment. He dared a cautious lick of the leaf and, to his shock, felt no numbness or pain, only a sharp, minty coolness. Panic flared, and for a heartbeat he wondered if he'd gone mad. Then he clenched his will, forced calm, and activated his evaluation skill. The system chimed like clockwork, declaring the sample marble grass, an edible plant perfect for drying and brewing into tea. And a grin split his face as he realized it wasn't poison, but a valuable natural ingredient. He vowed to treat Sarasu to its aromatic brew next time, and reminded himself to dry the leaves correctly. He heard rain patter, the first rain he'd seen since coming to this world. Wasting no time, he bolted to the forge and dived back into his work, determined to keep hammering until the storm eased. The system spat out the result again. Hellfire arrow, its flame burning at medium strength. Okuda whooped with genuine joy, triumphant at creating an elemental weapon, and glad he'd earlier infused his quiver with water, because a bold idea struck him. If he could graft elements into the quiver, then with his appraisal skill he could learn to enchant items. He did it. The system chimed that the element water plate had been created. An iron plate soaked in elemental water, moisture beating on its surface, and realization crashed over him. He could enchant not only weapons but armor and even household items. He needed scales to bulk up the plate. He'd grab them later. And the tests proved the plate harvested water far better than the water blades, a discovery that lit a fire in him. His mind exploded with possibilities. A self-filling mug that gushes water, a skillet that breathes fire, a broom that hungrily drags in dust, even a rope that turns things to stone. All brand new inventions that would be wildly useful and impossible to ignore. Power pulsing inside him, he seized his vow to retreat into quiet solitude away from the crowd, expose himself, and he'd risk catching that nobleman's eye again, and he wouldn't allow it. He marched back to work and immediately spotted Ash caked in mud. The dog adored the rain, which cracked a small smile on Okuda's face as Ash barked joyfully at his voice, and a deep breath of fresh air sent a sharp surge of energy through him. After a few days, the rain finally relented, and the sweet, loamy perfume of wet earth flooded the air. Under a brilliant blue sky where clouds drifted lazily, and the sun's soft warmth wrapped everything in peace. He'd already fed the animals and watered the garden. Now that hush was tugging at his eyelids, begging him to sleep. His gaze snapped to the approaching carriage, a cold knot of tension coiling in his gut. He sensed the odds tilting against him. Okuda silently prayed it was only a coincidence. Then Margot's voice sliced the air, calling his name, and Byron. The name Byron jolted a memory inside him, but he couldn't pin down where he'd heard it. So he yanked out his writing board and scribbled a question to try and start a dialogue. The guildmaster handpicked Margot, Juno, Kai, and him to escort that nobleman. The announcement hit him like a slap, and rage boiled in his veins. Doubt gnawed at him. Why were the nobles so desperate to seize the dungeon? The overcrowded depths were spilling monsters onto the surface. A ruthless purge felt inevitable, and it would protect Okuda by making his home safer. He distrusted Byron, a man who'd never experienced or understood the forces needed, yet still barked orders and forced his decisions. Plain and simple, he saw him as incompetent. He'd fought tooth and nail to dodge the expedition, but with the city's mightiest warriors at his back, the danger shrank. So hungry for a successful dungeon sweep, he steeled himself and kicked off preparations. The day had finally come. He locked on to Guildmaster Shuraku's unshakable calm and confidence, as Shuraku strode forward to thank the adventurers for their participation in the recent operation. Okuda, faced with the bitter truth that he couldn't match the others' fighting power, chose to join the support squad, healers, and those who backed them from the rear. And at that exact moment, Sarasa stepped up and, wordless, pressed a bracelet into his hand, leaving him stunned. He realized it wasn't just decoration, activated his appraisal skill, and the system instantly spat out the verdict. A bracelet granting poison resistance that lets its wearer shrug off toxins. Okuda gaped, amazed at how expensive such things were. Then thanked Sarasu sincerely and vowed to take care of her gift. Then he locked eyes with Kai. No hostility, just coiled tension and quiet, stubborn determination. Okuda felt the moment arrive and forced his breath steady, clinging to the truth that their group teemed with strength. If they kept their heads, even a deadly snake could be felled. Not a single monster crossed their path. Alarm flared. Every creature had swarmed straight into the dungeon. They reached the entrance, and Byron roared the command to launch the assault. The adventurer is hurled headlong into the screaming chaos of battle. Okuda watched, admiration roaring in his chest, as his comrades moved in perfect unison. The guildmaster, Kai, and the other warriors striking with honed strength. He anchored the support line, slinging potions to the wounded, and then realization slammed into him. A healer's role was just as vital, and if this kept up, he'd become a full-fledged healer. His last potions and herbs were gone. Monsters closed in like a vice around them, and the fighter's strength drained away. Alarm ripped through him as he watched the squad and Byron erupt into argument. He pleaded silently for them to end it and shout the order to retreat. Fortune smiled. He still chose to pull back. Even with the city's strongest fighters thrown into the fray, the attempt to seize the dungeon crumbled once more. Only one truth remained. Next time they'd have to confront enemies far more powerful. Okuda clenched his fists as fierce resolve ripped through him. He had to become stronger. When he returned home, he found Sarasa by a perfectly set table. She'd prepared everything ahead of time, pouring her soul into every dish. He choked out a thank you, his voice trembling as her concern struck him straight in the heart. Okuda felt it. No shared language. Yet their gestures and actions were sparking a growing understanding between them. Later the potion stood complete, exhaustion slammed into him, and he surrendered to rest. The night drifted by quietly, and when morning hit he realized, stunned, he hadn't felt this relaxed around people in ages. An odd, welcome change. Silence shattered with a sharp knock. Shuraku stood at the door. The guildmaster thrust the heavy sacks into his arms. They sagged with weight, packed to the brim with glittering gold coins. A letter tumbled out, and Okuda fired up his appraisal skill to decode it. A thank you note with payment for the unused potions. He was floored, but he still caught the gist. His efforts had been acknowledged. Shuraku named Margot and Juno. Okuda figured he should sling the heavy bags their way, noticing Shuraku's haggard, weathered face, likely worn down by dealings with those noblemen. He whipped around to his sleeping comrades and called them to breakfast, deciding a steaming cup of tea would be the only worthy way to start the day. They all showered him with thanks for the treat as Shiraku drained his tea and rose to leave. Okuda, seeing him already on his way, figured he must be busy and waved him off, thanking him for the visit. Hope surged in him. Maybe the crucial truth would finally reach that very nobleman. Even a team that strong couldn't cope with the dungeon. Maybe peace would hold for a while. They hadn't even managed a proper rest, and Okuda toyed with staging a wild consolation party to reignite morale and weld the group back together. Okuda's chest swelled with pride as he watched Juno and Margot devour the beef shashlik he'd made, and when their energy began to flag, he welcomed it, proof the evening might finally be winding down. By now, he'd already whipped up the soup, banking on it to restore everyone's strength after a grueling day. He felt the herb crush his hangover and ease his whole body. Margot peered into the pot, recognized the dish, and said it looked like shimino soup. And Okuda cut in short and sure, confirming his guess and bluntly telling him he was right. A flash struck him. Like before, everyone had devoured their food with obvious relish, pleasure beaming from their faces. When the night ended, he wished them good night and confirmed they'd definitely see each other tomorrow. The next morning, relief crashed over him. The soup had actually snapped everyone back to their senses. With guild business to handle, he suggested they head into town, and they went together, and on the way, Okuda faced his true craving, finally admitting he desperately wanted to master magic. He flashed back to that time a sorceress ripped a tornado from the sky and crushed a giant serpent, felt the pull of wind magic, his lifelong obsession, strike him clear, and realized mastery demanded brutal, painstaking practice and relentless training, just like any craft. Nail the basics and let slow, steady effort carve true skill. As they parted, Margot said she wanted to meet again and bade him farewell, and Okuda returned the goodbye lightly with a faint smile. He barreled into the guild and blurted that he wanted to study wind magic. Dan, posted at the entrance, gave a firm nod and confirmed it could be arranged. Okuda's jaw dropped when the dojo swung open before him, a place he'd never pictured as a school of magic. And even though the air inside hummed with strange power, he couldn't imagine Master Kai conjuring a single spell. Dan rapped on the door, called out to a man named Han, and asked him to take over the teaching. When the teacher's name landed, Okuda's pulse spiked. He froze when he saw Han, a noble-looking man with an artificial eye, standing there as the instructor of dark magic, and still Okuda bowed, eyes steady, asking with absolute seriousness and respect to learn from him. He pictured the countless battles and hardships that man must have survived. When Han unleashed wind magic before him, admiration surged through Okuda. It was stunning, and despite having no experience, he suddenly wanted to walk that same path. He chose to start simple. He painted the desired image in his mind, watched the air coil into a spiraling typhoon, tightened his focus, mouthed the spell, and funneled his magic straight into that wind vision. He toiled for hours until the magic finally ignited, the surge a weak whisper, insignificant. But the system chimed. Magic mastered, new skill unlocked, wind. Okuda clenched his jaw and vowed to push his training into overdrive to grow stronger. Clutching the image of the day he'd brew his own potions to sustain his strength and swearing to pour every ounce of himself into every session. Mid-training, he whirled playfully to his loyal dog Ash as the pup reveled in the spell's gusts. Then his eyes snapped to the trap. Someone had fallen in, a blue wolf. Ash lunged just in time, knocking his master's strike aside and saving the beast. Okuda's breath hitched as he realized the wolf was Ash's own kind, and it sat there calm, without a shred of aggression. Relief washed over him. He released the animal and murmured it could rest easy, but warned it not to come back. Later that evening, while thinking about wind magic, a bolt of inspiration struck him. He realized he could use it to blast hair dry in seconds. He flashed a grin at Ash and asked if he liked the feeling. His eyes snagged on the bracelet at his wrist, and it hit him. He'd never thanked Sarasa, so he decided to call Juno over to pick a return gift together. It hit him. Juno lived in the very tavern that had once helped him, and because he'd been there before, he threaded the familiar streets straight to its door. Okuda strode down to the tavern's first-floor bar and zeroed in on the counter. Right then, a man mumbled a few halting words to the girl and sprinted off. Okuda wondered if he'd become an accidental obstacle, and the girl turned to him with a warm, friendly greeting. Okuda blurted he was Juno's friend and asked which room she was in. The girl replied, 202. Relief flooded him, and he sprinted up to the second floor, found the right door, knocked, got no answer, called that he was coming in, and the door swung open to reveal Juno. He looked spent and frail, so Okuda stepped in, offered to wash him, and showed him how. Juno gave a single silent nod, And Okuda, seeing how much he'd endured, kept his questions to himself. He locked onto the bracelet again, spared Juno the chatter, snatched chalk and scrawled on the board. "Let's pick a gift for Sarasa. A thank you from me." Juno devoured the proposal, then nodded with iron certainty. She agreed. Outside, Okuda's chest tightened with worry for him. He confessed he couldn't decipher Juno's words, but the feelings behind them hit him loud and clear. His memory snapped to his own brutal low points when a friend simply sat with him and listened. Okuda uncovered a hard truth. Sometimes people don't need advice. They need someone to confirm their feelings are real. He could tell Juno had endured more than anyone should ever have to. He couldn't make sense of a single word, but the man's pain, sorrow, and raging inner struggle pounded through him. And that was enough to truly understand him. Juno flashed a grateful smile, thanked him for the day, and said goodbye. Okuda answered with a broad grin, wished him all the best, and promised they'd definitely see each other again. Okuda kept drilling his wind magic, chanting the wind spell aloud until the air quivered. Then he turned to Ash and apologized, voice tight as he explained he was doing it to watch his magic grow stronger. Out of nowhere, Margot snapped into being at his side and shouted his name. Surprise exploded inside Okuda, and his mind raced to untangle why she'd appeared. A prickling suspicion hit him. Margot still hadn't thanked Sarasa for the bracelet, and the brutal realization that reading another person's feelings is nearly impossible churned through him. A memory slammed into him. He and Juno had instantly thanked Sarasa. Then Okuda barked at Juno to thank him too. Overnight the state seized his house. Okuda snorted, wryly imagining it turning into a hotel. He also recalled hearing that other adventurers, sick of a noble's cruelty, had bolted from the city and set up new bases elsewhere. Okuda's guts snapped. The same scene had played out in the tavern, and he was sure anyone sane would have sprinted to the ends of the earth to get away from that revolting man. Okuda lay awake, fear coiling in his gut, and he finally admitted it to himself. A memory slammed into him. In the previous world, he had craved total, suffocating solitude. He slammed his phone shut and ghosted every message, starving for silence. After a while, the pull of people yanked him back, and he dove headfirst into conversations again. The same loop played out on social media. He deleted his accounts, then resurrected them and reconnected with everyone. He wanted to escape to the countryside because he was sick of forced office socializing. The daily parade of fake smiles revolted him, so he convinced himself he'd never speak to anyone again and hurled himself into total self-sufficiency, slashing human contact to the bare minimum. Plunged into a new world, the hunger for solitude still raged inside him. He clung to the belief that rare meetings and brief conversations would be more than enough. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Juno, Margot, and Sarasa, or so he convinced himself. Staring at everything, Okuda admitted he couldn't be sure his hunger for solitude wouldn't come roaring back. He knew his fiercest enemy was himself. Thoughts give no rest, and the more he fed them, the deeper he plunged into inner darkness. It slammed into him. He wasn't searching for answers. He was drowning in an abyss of despair. He felt like a fool who'd conjured needless worries again, and he thought that since he began this new life, his long-rooted fake smile had finally vanished. He'd unearthed something truly priceless, and peace flooded his heart for the first time in a long time. That odd bond with the three comrades forged into his lifeline, and he knew they'd stand by him until his last breath. The next morning he shut his forge, told the others he was about to make breakfast, and before the pan hit the flame, a contingent of nobles swept into his house. So out of nowhere, Okuda's blood ran cold, and he knew at once something was horribly wrong. He scoffed. Did anyone honestly believe the same squad could storm a dungeon without proper preparation? It was utterly impossible to him. He saw that when a person's anger reached its limit, his face snapped shut into stone-cold blankness, and Okuda knew he had to slip on a mask and paste on a smile. Byroon, a nobleman, strode up and called him by name. Okuda snapped too, every nerve on edge as suspicion flared, and he tried to figure out what Byroon wanted. Badarin exploded into his native tongue, every syllable a mystery to him. A blade flashed and severed one of Byron's hands. Though the pace was glacial, the wounds that tormented Byroon deep in his heart began to knit shut, and he held fast to the belief that with time, everything would mend and find its proper order. Memories of his former self clutched his throat, because that version of him had utterly snapped. After the tragic incident, he'd gone mad, his thoughts shrouded in fog, yet now he swore he wasn't insane anymore. Finally, Byroon tasted the razor-deep, excruciating ache in people's hearts. Wounds and the loss of close comrades stood among the most unbearable torments. A jagged pain tore through his chest as the faces of those who died because he hesitated slammed into him, and fury at his past self flared. He wanted to stab him. Regret for the atrocities he'd unleashed coiled inside him until his whole body racked with the crushing shock of guilt. In a single moment, watching his son step forward and make bold decisions, tears of joy streamed down Shikara's face. Heinrich had taken on running the city council and was steering it with steady, unshakable composure. Taxes and red tape tangled Byron at every turn, while his son Henry rose up and proved himself a magnificent, worthy leader. Rune's doubt hardened into a crushing verdict that he was unworthy to rule. He blamed himself for everything, kept it secret, recoiled from every look that, to him, screamed condemnation as anxiety coiled tighter around his chest. Once he drifted through life acting on impulse with no pressure. Now responsibility sits on his shoulders like a boulder that could crush him, and he aches to see the city burst alive with life and joy. Villagers thought it best he stay lost in madness. He knew that wouldn't fix a thing. Hiding behind locked doors would be easy, but it would abandon his duty to the people. Faces of neighbors he knew, and those he'd wounded slammed through his mind, and he seized the last of his courage to tell Chirac he'd stop at nothing to drag the city back from ruin. His body still quivered around others, but he'd recovered enough to snap to attention and answer the moment someone called his name. Shoraku strode up and apologized to Byron, revealing his son Heinrich had hiked the tax on monster kill rewards and struck an alliance with the guild to tackle the city's problems together. Byron wanted his son to keep ruling the city, and Shoraku expected Byron to agree. The realization slammed into him, dragging the gut-punching truth of just how much pain he'd unleashed on Chirac. Shame slammed into Rune for forcing the guildmaster to bow, and now he felt the full, stabbing weight of Shiraku's pain. Stifling the thrill, he bowed low before Chirac and poured out his regret. Clarity hit Byron. He saw Shiraku beginning to worry about him, but he couldn't stop halfway. He owned up to countless mistakes, the worst being how he'd forced others to bow before him, a truth he'd only just accepted. A cold truth slammed into him. He still owed apologies to a long list of people, especially the innocent adventurers he'd once unjustly thrown into prison, and he suspected many now seethed with hatred for him. His actions had unleashed a chain of disasters that swept across the entire city. Shiraku urged Byron to leave immediately, and Byron, heart sinking, couldn't help but agree. With each passing day he grew certain. Henry was dodging him, ducking every attempt to talk. He couldn't read his son's mind and braced for a tax hike. Then Henry strode up and bellowed that the guild must take responsibility for the city's safety. They'd reached the decision together. Byron couldn't tell if his son had done it to honor him, couldn't fathom all his motives, and a cold weight settled in his chest. He'd failed as a father and as a man. If his son ever walked his path and wielded that power to harm people and cause suffering, Byron stood ready to drag him back onto the right path. He saw it as his unwavering duty as a parent. Lester von Byron, still not fully restored, already strode freely among his residents and across the surrounding lands. Byron swept through every neighborhood, apologizing to residents. Given the chance, he wanted to mend every relationship, and at last he understood how brutally hard true forgiveness is. Driven by that resolve, Byron threw himself into the fight, knowing locking himself away again wouldn't change a thing, so he asked the butler to care for Melty the horse. The butler nodded and vowed he'd see it done. Byron realized a steadfast guardian stood at his side, bowed low to thank Tony for shielding him, and Tony vowed he'd keep guarding him. Byron thundered with iron confidence, swearing he'd honor his noble duty, and from this moment on move heaven and earth to atone for every sin. A monstrous form erupted into the clearing and shattered the silence. Shiraku howled Byron's name, fear clawing at his throat. Beside him, Juno barked about which way to flee, confusion tangling her words. Okuda replied tersely that he understood the situation, then conjured a shimmering barrier to shelter them. Fear seized Okuda, his legs refusing to obey as he froze, praying the monster wouldn't notice him. Meanwhile, Sarasa wrapped Byron's wound and kept insisting everything should be fine, saying it so often it sounded like she was trying to convince herself and everyone else. Days later, Okuda roared that they'd survived the desperate fight to pin that thought down. Juno whipped around, worry blazing in her eyes. He met her gaze, nodded, and assured her he was fine. He kept a calm face, but inside panic froze him. Helpless and motionless, yet a burning duty screamed to be finished this instant. Okuda threw himself into brewing potions, desperate for anything that might help. He knew even with magical aid and elixirs, restoring a severed arm would be nearly impossible, and the only consolation was that the attack hadn't killed anyone. The copper stench of his own blood slapped him awake. He knew he had to wash it off, but a choking fog was thickening, and it always rolled in with daylight. He later burst into the guild building, strode up to Dan and pressed him to raise the quest's reward. He remembered the guild had already posted a subjugation request, so he deliberately jacked up the reward to lure veteran powerhouse adventurers. The simple creature they'd underestimated was actually a lower dragon, and if it had targeted Okuda himself, he would have died without a chance. Tension coiled in him as he imagined being trapped in endless fear, every moment bracing for the next attack. Back home, he hunted every corner, forcing himself to accept the silence. He thought about going to Margot, then coldly decided no place would shield him from an attack. Death would catch him no matter where he hid. He chose to stay home and force a distraction. Thoughts spinning as he couldn't tell if the thick fog swallowing his house was a comfort or a threat. Okuda tried to fight his fear withdrawing, but his hands trembled non-stop and shattered his focus. Morning slammed in and he realized he hadn't slept a wink. Spotting the cheerful dog Ash, he thought he should have staggered to Margot's and drunk himself until he passed out. Then a familiar voice split the silence at the door. Margot and Juno. Okuda flung the door open and admitted the unexpected visitor had terrified him. Margot thrust a paper with the dragon sketched on it into view, then ripped it in two, leaving Okuda stunned. Relief slammed into him when the threat vanished, and later it hit him. The colossal lizard they'd feared as a forest dungeon monster had actually flown in from distant lands and was only passing nearby. Word spread that top-tier adventurers had already taken her down in a distant city. Peace rolled back into his life and a lightness lifted his soul. But he knew new monsters could surface and attack at any moment. He spotted the new creature and knew at once it was a monster, lost in the fog and stumbling straight to his house by accident. He snapped into assessment as the system spit out the label. A fighting bull, a cow-like monster that lived by the water in the Lancaster region, and Okuda blinked, realizing it was a bull after first mistaking it for a cow. When the fear died, hunger tore through him, and he blamed Margot and Juno for everything, convinced their overflowing kindness had caused it all. Maybe it was the moment he watched a nobleman's arm get hacked off. He seethed. He'd been saddled with every single meal to cook. He blinked, and the thick fog had already vanished. Okuda pitched a feast overflowing with sizzling steaks, steaming matsunabe, smoked meats, rich liver, and a variety of other meat dishes. They dove into the meal, laughter exploding around the table as they savored every joyful moment. Later they craned their necks, drinking in the night sky's riot of stars. Okuda flinched as Margot's snores thundered through the room, and he suddenly remembered the Shimano soup he'd forgotten to drink. He scanned his friends and registered the weariness carved into their faces. Clarity hit him. He could finally open up to them, their bond forged so solid they could call each other best friends. The soup didn't so much as dent the night's drinking. He reheated it and filed away that the herbs packed a brutal punch. They regrouped, and he urged them to join him in the forest to gather herbs. His friends agreed, and he thanked them with a relieved, grateful grin. Stunned and oddly comforted, he realized that even in a forest buzzing with danger, his heart rested in calm. They rushed back with a mountain of herbs, and he whooped, triumph crackling in his veins. Margot's shout shattered the silence as she called to Juno and Okuda. He sprang into action as monsters surged in. Okuda spotted a blue wolf locked in brutal combat with another monster, drew his bow, and loosed arrows from afar to help. Okuda skyrocketed to level 14, telling himself he wouldn't take someone else's prey. Then his arrow sliced through the fray and dealt the final blow. He clasped his friends' hands, poured out his thanks, and urged them to post a guild request to subdue a lower dragon as a precaution against any looming threat. Margot accepted. Okuda flashed a grateful grin, thanked him again, then turned and delivered a quick, decisive goodbye. He let the beetle's steady buzz wash over him, a rare calm knitting itself into his bones. The instant he pictured the future, tears exploded down his face. Tears streamed down Okuda's face, baffling him. He hadn't had a single drink all day. He'd claimed he preferred solitude. Then a raw truth crashed into him. The warmth that had found its way into his heart would never leave. When everyone left, loneliness slammed into him with brutal intensity. Okuda felt the truth slam into him. All good things come to an end. The fun, the singing, the cool night wind, the buzzing of bugs. Fear slammed into him, certain the lonely night would never end. Confusion screamed inside him. He couldn't understand what was happening to him. Maybe it was the pressure from those recent stressors finally erupting. He snatched a steaming cup of herbal tea to calm the storm. Knew why he felt this way, but refused to accept the truth. Okuda. I realized I had become an adult who couldn't let go of his loneliness. He snapped awake in the morning, the world tilting as dizziness slammed him and his limbs sank into lead, a burning fever crawling through him until he knew He was seriously sick. He scrambled to cook the chicken's food, then his strength deserted him. His knees buckled and darkness swallowed him. Shiraku, master of Leicester's Adventurer Guild, realized that recently the city's nobleman Byron had been mistreating adventurers. A torrent of complaints poured in through the worker Dan, and as Guildmaster Shiraku felt compelled to confront Byron. His position catapulted him into a seat on the city council. The guild vowed to annihilate the monsters and seize the dungeon, and Shiraku spelled out every brutal detail and lurking risk to Beirun. Byron doubled down on subjugating the cockatrice. Q begged him to stop, but it was useless. Q couldn't stand idly by as adventurers kept dying for nothing, and Byron flat out forbade hiring any new workers. Only Juno, Margot, and Okuda dared face the cockatrice. Okuda, a healing genius who could reverse petrification. A different trio had slain the snake and were hailed among the strongest, including Lester. Even martial arts teacher Kai could land a crushing rebuff on the beast. No one expected to run into several cockatrices. Okuda's lightning reflexes pulled them back from death's door, and Shiraku's gratitude was beyond words. The ruins offered a measly 5 gold coins. No adventurer would risk his life for that. Dan stared at Shiraku with hollow eyes, powerless, and with the guild's honor on the line, he emptied his purse and the guild coffers to scrape together the needed gold. After this, Shiraku implored Beirun to give in. He pleaded with him again and again until his hair began to fall out. At that moment, a hole tore open in the stomach, yet all the symptoms erupted on the head. In the end, Beirun ordered the exact same people who'd been there last time to be gathered. Shirak kept bowing his head over and over, interrupting Keigo and Okudo as he begged forgiveness for springing this on them. Beirun stayed silent, and regret gnawed at Shiraku for being such a lousy guildmaster. Beirun vaulted off his horse to invite him, only to be ambushed by a lower dragon that ripped his right arm clean off. Shiraku hurled himself at the monster to shield Beirun, fought with brutal ferocity, and finally forced the beast to flee. From then on, Beethoven shut himself away in his room. The butler said he never emerged and meals were left at his door. He whispered to a horse statue. The city suffered for it, and Henry, Beirun's son, spoke with his father and soon became the family's heir. Henry cut a stark contrast to his father, radiating quiet wisdom, and Shiraku's restless heart finally stilled. Beirun, a nobleman who had his right arm torn off fighting a lesser dragon, now moved through the world gripped by a devouring fear. Fear clawed at him until he slammed his door, locked himself inside, and refused to step outside. Loneliness gnawed at him, so he summoned his favorite horse, Melty, straight into his chambers. His odd behavior had everyone whispering that he'd lost his mind, and Byron was sure they were laughing at him. Every snicker fanned a fever of anxiety that curdled into full-blown paranoia. He flinched at the flutter of birds and the buzz of insects, a fierce urge to punish anyone he thought was laughing at him burning in his chest. He all but stepped away from running the city, avoiding people because they flooded him with panic and made his remaining hand shake. And losing his right hand turned eating into a daily struggle, while voices in his head hissed that he deserved the pain. Beirun refused the label crazy, yet confessed fear shadowed him in every corner. The servants turned their backs on him, insomnia ate at him, and he wanted to vanish from this world, spitting curses at everything around him. He couldn't recall the last morning he hauled himself out of bed without feeling ripped from the person he used to be. In those bleak days, Guildmaster Shiraku hunted down someone who could free Melty from her petrification, and that single act reignited Byron's will to live. He began stepping into daylight to stay by Melty's side, and slowly happiness returned to him. Sleep's grip finally slackened, yet shame still kept him from meeting his servant's eyes. A soft, caring voice murmured that it had brought a canned peach and wished her a speedy recovery. Okuda, overflowing with gratitude, cried out, "Mommy!" Okuda bolted upright, pulse hammering, as everything he'd just lived through collapsed into the cold truth. It had all been a dream, not reality. His first thought. The fever that had tormented him was gone, and relief slammed into him like a cool, cleansing wave. He jerked awake, panic clawing at his throat. He'd been unconscious for days after his strength failed, and he collapsed from sheer exhaustion. That day he frantically fed the chickens, murmuring an apology that he hadn't had time to prepare their food before fatigue finally toppled him. Okuda exhaled like he'd dodged a bullet. His health was already improving and, by freak luck, no customers had come while he was sick. Still, he admitted, bitterly, that he was terrified of dying completely alone with no one to help. And the word kodokushi, dying alone and not being found for a long time, slammed into his mind. Sorrow knotted his gut as he pictured his mother, unreachable now, probably convinced he'd run off and abandoned everything. Pain ripped through Okuda as he realized how precious everyone had become after all he'd been through. Hope flared that Margot and the others would be fine without him. He scolded himself. As useless, grudgingly admitted the fever had passed, but his body still demanded rest, and he resolved to spend the day quietly, forcing himself to relax and brew a couple of potions. As he watched the potion brewing, his gaze snapped to a familiar figure, Juno, and Okuda recognized him in an instant, noting to himself he hadn't seen this man in years. Okuda learned Juno had arrived with an offer to join a subjugation mission, but he confessed he'd only just recovered from an illness, sapped and feeble, so he politely turned it down. Juno shrugged off the refusal, turned cool as ice and called, "I'll be back tomorrow," while Okuda watched him go and called after him with a hopeful, "Good luck, come back safe." Then, left alone, replayed his symptoms, recalled Juno saying there was a doctor in town, realized potions couldn't always crush a fever, and decided the hospital was the smart move. Later, while scanning his supplies, Okuda gaped at the stack of potions he'd cranked out, and Juno strode up again, calling his name. Surprise flashed across Okuda's face as he asked if Juno had been hunting. His worn, tired look gave it away. Spotting medicinal plants and food in Juno's cart, Okuda guessed he'd stopped in town before any mission, and Juno grinned, saying it was all for Okuda. Okuda's eyes glistened as he blurted a shaky, heartfelt thanks to Juno, but the only things he had to offer were the potions. He urged Juno to stay the night, relief surging through him at the thought of a friend by his side when the nights turned brutal. Juno blurted that so much went down while Okuda lay sick. Okuda vowed to end his laziness, but first he insisted on one glorious, uninterrupted night of sleep. That morning, Juno bade Okuda farewell, and Okuda sent him off with a quick wish of luck. After a solid night's sleep, Okuda woke refreshed and rolled his shoulders into a long, relieving stretch. Byron, the nobleman Okuda had once dismissed as an idiot, strode in alone, no adventurers at his side, and Okuda clamped his mouth shut about the three of them heading into the forest. Byron snapped into a deep bow and apologized to Okuda, leaving Okuda frozen and wide-eyed. Okuda couldn't believe his ears. Was this really happening? Moments later, Beirun thrust a heavy bag into his hands. Its weight stunned him, and, when he looked inside, roughly 500 glittering gold coins spilled into view, and he couldn't stop asking what Beirun hoped to achieve with this gesture. He figured this was Byron repaying old favors, and the gesture stunned him. Remembering their last meeting, he saw Byron had become a decent man. Okuda read raw remorse in his posture and let doubt fall away. With the nobleman's threat gone, he took the gift and vowed to start small, treating Byron to something delicious. The scene at home washed over him like a warm, familiar blanket, and he suddenly remembered that smoked meat ruled the tables of the nobility. Tony, the nobleman's bodyguard, dropped the bomb that his master had been replaced by his son, and Okuda felt the world tilt as he realized how much had changed during his illness. He charged into the kitchen and fried a whole hare in sizzling garlic, salt, and herbs, convinced this strange creation would seduce the upper class and pouring every ounce of culinary skill into it. Byron's expression at the tasting flipped into something totally unexpected, and Okuda knew the effort had paid off. Ash the dog came up begging for a treat, and Okuda promised she'd get food too, insisting she eat her vegetables. He locked onto the noblemen's bearing and Tony's trail, both slicing into the forest and charging for the stables, not the city. He grappled to restrain them until exhaustion gnawed at his bones. They sprawled like drunken commoners, and he told himself he'd hand them a steaming bowl of Shimano soup when they woke. That morning, exactly as he'd feared, he found them gaunt and broken, yet the sight still knocked the wind out of him. He said goodbye, urging them to take care of themselves. He'd stockpiled a fortune. Now the moment had come to mastermind how to put every penny to smart use. He strode to a trusted merchant to haggle future investments, then ran into Margot, Juno, and Sarasa in town, and they thrashed out plans to mount crossbows and raise stone walls around his property. Noting stone beats dirt, he declared he wanted a proper bath and bedroom, and with plenty of coin left, he grumbled that he was tired of living in a chicken coop. They sealed a pact to keep cooperating. He rallied his friends to set up meetings with artisans and building material suppliers, then tracked down Dr. Kishu, sensei, to secure medical care. He couldn't gauge how advanced medicine was here, but relief flooded him at the mere existence of doctors, and he told Sarasa to deliver every purchase, from materials to food, straight to his home. Okuda vowed to smoke the meat, turning it into a smoky thank you for the friends who'd helped him. Realizing he could never slip back into the hermit life, he bowed deeply and thanked them with every ounce of gratitude in his heart. A few days later, he circled the place like a victorious general, eyes alight with admiration at the newly raised protective wall, the solid bed, and the cozy bedroom. He declared his new home a fortress, a dream finally realized. Okuda hoped snakes and flying lizards would no longer see him as prey, and he thanked everyone who had helped him from the bottom of his heart. Margot stormed up and shouted. Okuda grinned and proposed a toast to the finished construction, thrusting a drink his way. Margot asked if Sarasa was nearby, and he said she wasn't. A cold realization hit Okuda. Margot was dodging any chance to meet her. Margot hoisted his glass and called for a drink to celebrate the construction's completion. Okuda realized he still hadn't squeezed in a second taste of the shimino soup, remembered drinking with his best friend until sunrise, and declared that alone worth celebrating. He pronounced them both hopeless adults. He jolted awake the next morning with a leaden head, certain that walking away from the shimeno soup had been a fatal mistake. Okuda crashed to the ground, shame flaring as he realized he'd slipped back into laziness. A few days after the stone walls of his house finally rose, a long-awaited security washed over him, and he let his guard fall. With the threat gone, the energy he usually burned on everyday tasks plummeted from 10% to just 3%. Gold coins jingled in his pouch, work vanished from his mind, and he slept and woke on a whim. The dreams he'd cherished earlier were bursting into life. Maybe he'd slept too long the day before. It was still before dawn, the sun hadn't even risen, and he was already awake. He snapped his eyes open, the first awake that morning, while the animals around him lay curled up, still lost in peaceful sleep. Bathed in rare silence, he seized the calm and corralled his runaway thoughts. Relief exploded through him. Juno loved Sarasa back, and he couldn't stop grinning. From the outside, Sarasa seemed to spare Margot a sliver of sympathy. Okuda wondered if Juno had quietly abandoned his campaign to win her favor. It would have been easier if he'd picked someone else, but Okuda knew Juno was a good guy who probably wasn't short on female attention. Margot dodged every one of Saras's relentless attempts to catch his eye. Triumph crouched a heartbeat away, waiting just around the corner. Runham's memory jolted to Okudo. His missing arm could explain why he'd been acting so strangely. He pressed gold into Okuda's hands as an apology, and that gold raised a stone wall that became their salvation. He snuffed out the grudge against Beirun. Holding on was pointless. His gaze snapped to Byron's son, the new ruler of the city, whom Margot and the others warned was abusing his power. Okuda kept his distance from the nobles but stood ready to jump in the moment things turned dangerous. Memories of the many people he'd met slammed into him. Secretary Dan, the guildmaster Shuraku, Kai-sensei, and Han-sensei, who taught him useful skills. 3 adventurers rallied to his side. A mason craftsman raised the stone walls of his home, and later Dr. Keisha, Byron guard Tony, Baker Taylor, and many others took him under their wing. Back in that world, he clawed through each day to survive, too consumed to care for anyone else. Then the truth hit him. No one makes it alone. And he battled that reality tooth and nail until his last breath, still clutching the memories he refused to lose. To him, Ash was the cutest, fluffiest creature alive, and he vowed he'd keep it that way forever. Daylight thinned as autumn crept in and winter waited at the gates. When the first snow fell, he'd ask Margot to install a fireplace, and the idea of sinking into a hot bath while flakes drifted outside thrilled him. After a string of lazy days, he decided he'd sleep first, then dive into a bath. That morning, Okuda's memory snapped. He'd left his fishing rod here, and at last his hands closed on it. It still looked perfectly functional, so he threaded a local worm onto the hook and cast his line. He sprinted to the river, eyes sweeping the bank, no monsters in sight. For the first time in ages, he finally sat in silence by the water. Then the rod snapped to life and he hooked something. It was an IU fish. He dared to taste it. Parasite-free, it could become sashimi, and his razor-sharp filleting skills honed in Japan finally paid off. He sliced it with laser focus, took a bite that detonated with flavor, and the system pinged to confirm the fish was unmistakably delicious. He ran through the options: pickle it, fry it, or slice it into sashimi. Decided to catch more, then exhaustion slammed him and he crashed asleep. He shot awake as joy flooded him. His friends were right there, all safe. Resolve hardened in Okuda. The fishing was over, and he had to move on. He sprang to his feet, summoned his horse Rasenide, and rode off. Okuda sprinted home and burst through the door, his heart soaring when he saw his friends already gathered inside. Inside, the air crackled with preparation as everyone hustled and buzzed for the celebration. By pure luck, he'd just hauled in a massive catch of fresh fish, so the night promised to be especially delicious, and he urged everyone to raise their glasses. Such gatherings demanded real treats and a warm, hearty feast. The friendly cooking sprang to life. Okuda set to work on the fish, meticulously grating the garlic and directing where each clove should go, then took the knife and began making the sashimi himself, suddenly remembering he'd never seen raw fish served in the city, and burning to see how his guests would take this Japanese delicacy. When everything was ready, he bellowed that the food was served and beckoned everyone to the table. They kicked off the feast with shioyaki, crispy, salt-kissed fried fish, then dove into a pristine platter of sashimi. Sarasa gasped at the unfamiliar dish as Okuda seized a lemon, squeezed it with a chef's flourish, and declared that sashimi explodes with flavor when served the right way. Their faces screamed first time at this cuisine, and he couldn't hide the thrill as they fell in love with every bite. It hit him. Juno's spark had dimmed and she looked quietly downcast. His grin widened as he pressed another plate into his hands, urging him to taste it and swearing the flavor would bring him back to life. Juno, still confused, mixed up the dishes and blurted sashimi as shioyaki, sending an awkward hush over the table. Okuda acted like nothing happened and poured another round for everyone to keep the party alive. Seeing the atmosphere soften, he burst in to liven things by congratulating Margot and Sarasa. Their tender display yesterday screamed wedding, and the young couple beamed, confirmed his hunch, and thanked him. He discovered they'd slated the wedding at his house in just 2 days, inviting only their closest family. And Okuda watched Juno slump, dejection written all over her. He scanned the guest list and froze. Elsa was on it, listed as Juno's girlfriend, and shock ripped through him. Juno already had a lover. All yesterday's sympathy-soaked talks had gone to waste, yet anger couldn't touch him. Joy for his friend surged through him, and when the evening ended, Sarasa thanked him for everything and they said goodbye until their next meeting. Left alone, Okuda stared down the ticking 2 days until his best friend's wedding, and began feverishly planning a bath, entertainment, and food. He plunged into the cooking first, went fishing, and even sacrificed his chickens because everyone loved fish. The wedding day loomed, and that morning the fishing struck gold. The nets groaned under an astonishing haul. He skewered yakitori with fierce devotion, pouring care and love into every bite, his chest swelling with pride at the breaded chicken he hailed as a top-class dish. Now only the fresh fish waited to be prepared. Just as the last preparations snapped into place, the occasion's heroes burst in, Margot and Sarasa. Juno trailed them and presented his companion, Lady Elsa. Okuda stepped forward, a warm smile blooming as he greeted her. Inside, a flicker of recognition hit him. She was the tavern owner's daughter from the very tavern Juno lived in, and his thoughts surged as he realized how lucky Juno was. Elsa wasn't just beautiful, she was genuinely kind. Genuine joy surged through him. He'd watched his friend fight through relentless hardships. After congratulating Juno, he snapped into action and plunged headfirst into the final preparations. Barun's son burst onto the scene. His presence slammed into the room. Every head snapped around and jaws dropped. Kuda's gaze snapped. He'd never laid eyes on this man before. Margot blanched at the guest's arrival. His presence spelled nothing but trouble. He couldn't fathom what was unfolding, but one truth slammed into him. Only a savage could ruin a day this special. The blue wolf prowls the dense wild forest like a proud hunter, thriving under its free, harsh sky, born into a pack ruled by a wise, iron-strong leader and bound to him by fierce respect, unshakable loyalty, and the spirit of unity. One day, a strange, towering man burst into their lives with powers the blue wolf had never seen. A high-ranking figure of his kind who wielded alien magic, crushed the leader in a savage fight, snatched the leader's cub and strode away, leaving the pack orphaned and reeling. The wolf knew that if he'd charged in that day, he'd be dead for sure. Unprepared and blind to the enemy's magic, he never stood a chance. With their leader gone, the pack reeled directionless and the pup's fate fell into a human's hands. Alarm flared at first, but over time the blue wolves watched the man shield and nurture the cub as if it were his own. The world crushed the weak, only the strongest survived. No rule could overturn that primal order. And in the heart of a devoted beast, a new feeling rose. Respect. Seeing battle was hopeless, the blue wolves swore a silent loyalty and kept vigil over the puppy and his new protector from afar. They never barged in. They sprang to the pup's aid only when danger struck, and out of respect they'd drive off prowling beasts. Then one day a blue wolf crept too close to camp and fell under a strange, corrupting magic. Control ripped from him and blood pooled at his side. As he braced for death, a tiny puppy appeared, and now grown. That same pup threw its body over the wolf without a thought for itself, making the beast's heart hammer in disbelief. In a world ruled by kill or be killed, that kind of mercy was almost unheard of. That man, this uncanny, almost alien wolf, didn't turn away. He tended his wounds, healed him, and watched with fierce concern, proving once again that before them stood not just a man but something stranger, deeper, nobler. One clear morning, a man and his puppy went to the lake to fish while the wolves watched from afar as always, until a bear erupted from the woods, charging straight at them to attack. The blue wolves surged into the fray, claws flashing and jaws snapping, fighting with everything they had until the beast was driven away. When they stumbled back from the fight, they found a gut punch, an exhausted but unharmed puppy, peacefully resting in a man's arms, a sight that softened even the rough heart of the warrior of the forest. When the wolves stormed back to camp, it lay deserted, no people, just still warm fish and a wooden cup cradling a potion, left like a quiet thank you. It was a sign. The man had mastered every secret of wolves, knew the help they could give and honored it. And the wolf yielded, not to force, but undone by this man's fierce humanity and unexpected kindness. Years have passed, yet the blue wolves still stand guard over the territory where this man and his ward live, harboring a burning hope that the puppy will grow up strong, wise, and fair, because blue wolves aren't mere animals, but intelligent creatures of this forest, loyal, proud, and full of feeling. Elsa commands a tavern and bar in the city of Leicester, a thunderous crossroads where the destinies of wanderers, artisans, and adventurers collide. With fierce tenderness and hard-headed practicality, she forged not just an inn, but a true home for those who can't afford one, especially poor adventurers scraping by on combat earnings and teetering between life and death. Elsa's tavern rents the cheapest beds in the area and serves up warmth, hot food, steady care, and the sympathy that keeps them going. Among the establishment's regulars, Juno cut a striking figure, an adventurer with a kind heart and indomitable spirit. Elsa, who'd known him and his friend Sarasa since childhood, watched years of gentle fondness flare into fierce love, then felt her chest drop when she realized his heart belonged to another Sarasa. She knew it instantly, because someone in love can sense even the faintest shadow of another's sympathy. Pain cut Juno silent and sharp when she realized Sarasa didn't return her love. Sarasa's heart belonged to Margot, a master blacksmith and talented merchant who shaped metal like a painter wields a brush, and, bitter as Elsa felt, she had to admit they were perfect for each other. Juno was suffering. His love shredded him from the inside. He wasted away, losing weight and sinking into sullen distance. The man who lived by raw strength letting himself rot, while Elsa fought to keep him alive, tending him, feeding him and pleading for him to eat. He lashed out with words, sometimes savage, pushing her away. She stayed close, endured, refused to leave. Her love demanded nothing in return. It simply was. Every morning Elsa stared into the mirror, tracing the freckles she'd once found charming and knowing to her core that Sarasa wasn't just beautiful on the outside, but a kind-hearted, worthy woman. Elsa's heart splintered, green with envy and sour with bitterness, burning to stand in the place of the one Juno would give his soul to. And then everything changed. Just as Elsa teetered on the brink of giving up, Juno blurted the words she'd been aching to hear. He wanted her to be his girlfriend, and his confession smashed her walls, unleashing a flood of tears. They tore into a brutal, honest confession. Margot had once forced the ghost of his late wife Isabella to fade, and Juno had found the steel to crush his lingering feelings for Sarasa. Unease still stung Elsa whenever memories of his old love surfaced, but with every secret laid bare and him certain she loved him, happiness flooded her. It was the brightest day of her life. On Margot and Saras's wedding day, Elsa transformed. She slipped into her favorite dress, laced up the shoes she'd been saving for this exact moment, and clipped on the jewelry and the earring Juno had once given her. She refused to smother her freckles with makeup. When Juno smiled and said he liked them, she ripped off the mask and embraced herself completely. At Juno's friend Okuta's house, the wedding took place, and Elsa's mind leapt back to the day he walked into her tavern. Charisma like midnight, hair black as ink, a gentle gaze that carved itself into her memory, and that tiny, impossible puppy that stole her heart. Seeing him again lit a warm thrill of joy and hopeful anticipation in her chest. So with love, faith in tomorrow, and steady inner strength, she stepped into the new day. In the city of Leicester, the new ruler was Lord Henry, the son of the previous ruler whose reign was stained by ruthless tyranny. Determined to step out of his father's shadow, Henry relentlessly courted the townspeople's trust, winning over influential figures and everyday citizens until his position became unshakable. They called him wise, and he reveled in the heady power of knowing his decisions could rewrite reality. Clinging to power, Henry slammed crushing taxes on the people and drove them to toil for him until they collapsed from exhaustion. when his father tried to seize control by hiking taxes to bankroll the Adventurers Guild and the army. Heinrich crushed that ambition, reclaimed the city, and convinced the threat was over, already plotted his next move. While poring over the city's economy, Henry's gaze locked on Margot's weapon shop, selling fire and water daggers that flew off the shelves and ignited the city's comeback. Sensing an opening, Henry snapped into action, deciding to seize control of Margot and dictate every move he made. His subordinates spilled that Margot abruptly pulled those weapons from the market, sparking rumors he'd been supplied by a hidden source. Heinrich skidded up to the shuttered shop and watched Margot and his companion's carriage vanish through the city gates. Convinced their destination hid the secret behind those strange daggers, he snarled an order and dispatched 4 subordinates to tail them. Henry vowed to make Margot pay every bill and spin the whole situation into double profit. Okuda froze, jaw dropping, scrambling to untangle the chaos unfolding before him. He spotted a stranger who'd barged into his house uninvited and snapped, fury lacing every word. Okuda snatched his phone and slammed the call button for security, but the line stayed dead. When he saw arguing with the influential figure was useless, he played his ace, slammed a plate of sashimi forward, and urged the uninvited guest to try it to calm the tension. Byron burst into view and called Henry's name. In that instant, Okuda realized the stranger was Byron's son. It hit Okuda. This argument didn't come from nowhere. It sprang from family differences. It was a special day. He slammed his palm down and roared for everyone to quiet down and hang on his every word. Byron bit into the sashimi, and his eyes lit up as a burst of clean, ocean-fresh flavor hit him. He hadn't expected it to be this amazing. Margot confirmed it was sashimi, and Okuda exploded with joy, grinning as he urged everyone to save some for the other guests. Realizing more people meant bigger joy, he proposed inviting everyone to Margot and Sarasa's wedding, and Henry agreed to attend. Margot shot Okuda a grateful smile and thanked him for his help. He shrugged, grinned, and replied, "No problem." Okuda's jaw dropped as a flood of helpers poured in, far more than he'd expected, and he barked that there was no time for quarrels, while the party preparations spun into a wild, full-throttle frenzy. At last, the long-awaited moment had arrived. Byron whirled to Margot and Sarasa the instant they stepped into the hall. Okuda's eyes widened. He almost never saw Margot in a jacket, and Saras's moon-colored dress set her beauty ablaze. Margot and Sarasa vowed forever, slipped rings onto each other's fingers, and the guests exploded into congratulations. Okuda's jaw dropped. He'd never seen a wedding like this in this world, yet smiles bloomed on every face, unconscious and unstoppable. The mood flipped on a dime, and everyone barreled straight into the party. Okuda slammed platters of sashimi and chicken onto the table, and urged everyone to dig in, while 2 men performed a strange art that left him utterly baffled. A memory snapped into place. Back in his merchant days, those fairs ran the silly stalking-over-the-head games that still sent a chill racing up his spine. Relief flooded him. This world held no brutal competitions, yet worry gnawed at his gut. The ceremony had no wedding song. Okuda stormed on stage and announced he'd sing, and as he sang he bared the anxiety that haunted him when he was alone, pouring out a song about friends slowly drifting apart, finding their places in life and ending up henpacked, as they themselves said. Okuda insisted that even without understanding the language, the song's meaning punches straight into your heart, and when he finished his performance he beamed and congratulated the young people. As the party wound down, Sarasa and Elsa hugged and vowed to meet again, while Okuda waved them off, wishing them all the best. Margot, Sarasa, and Elsa slipped home, leaving the rest of the guests sprawled drunk, and Okuda wrestled the lot into motion, scowling at their state and threatening to hurl them into the smelter for a night like this. Later, he let the cool night wind wash over him, and for a heartbeat the whole fuss slipped away like a dream. Since stepping into this world, Okuda watched humans twist themselves into contradictions, shut one another out, and slowly march toward extinction. Against the odds, he forged a tight crew to light up his best moments. Margot, Juno, Sarasa, Elsa, and Ash, the absolute cutest creature in the world. He watched the room fall under the newlyweds' spell, everyone mesmerized by their smiles, even him. A radiant circle of happiness formed with Margot and Sarasa blazing at its center. Okuda admitted he'd never seen anything like it in Japan. He realized words could slash like blades or hold up a mirror. One line could tear you open, the next strip everything down to the raw truth. Okuda admitted he'd been dodging this, insisting on calling every shot himself instead of trusting anyone. And in a land where no one speaks Japanese and you have to risk your life fighting monsters, the blue moon's light tore down from the sky and struck your heart. And Okuda wondered if it was all a dream. Because only a dream could untangle these contradictions. He cracked his heart open to others, chose patience to savor what he had, and for now charged ahead with his life, hungry for the contradictions tomorrow would bring. A grin burst from him as the truth hit. He'd once been a walking contradiction. Okuda tossed aside the chores with a grin and suggested leaving the cleaning until tomorrow. Today they'd relax. His friends were way too noisy. He'd always thrived on making others happy, and now that rush slammed into him harder than ever. The day after the wedding ceremony, Okuda tore right back into wind magic training, hell-bent on sharpening his skills. While everyone else lingered in the holiday haze, he'd already snapped back into his old routine. Ash's thunderous bark snapped him to attention. Okuda spun around and came face to fang with a giant snake. No time to think, no help coming, so he lunged into action. Okuda loosed piercing arrow at the serpent, but the spell skittered off its scales. Seeing no obvious weak points, he activated Skill Scan to expose the beast's vulnerabilities. The system blared that Okuda had leveled up and his scans spiked to level 2, revealing the snake's skill. Deadly poison. A corrosive toxin that chews through almost anything but isn't immune to other toxins. And Okuda snapped into action, planning to hurl its venom back at it with a gust of wind. The blue wolf slammed in, assaulting the snake and yanking its focus away. Okuda seized the opening, eyes locked on the serpent, timing the exact instant it would unleash its poisonous breath. The instant the snake gaped, Okuda unleashed a spell, a savage gust that flung the poison straight back at the monster. The snake curled inward, scales flaking off like cracked armor, bearing a raw, vulnerable spot. Okuda seized the opening and drove his sword home, a decisive, thunderous strike that finally felled his opponent. After the battle, the system blared that Okuda had skyrocketed to level 15. He shouted a fierce thank you to the blue wolf for arriving just in time, then rushed to check he was okay. Later, when Juno found out about Okuda's feat, his jaw dropped and he let out a stunned gasp. Okuda, reeling from the shock, joined Juno in clearing the blood-smeared battlefield and hauled the snake's carcass to the city butcher. And moments later, Elsa arrived, her face tight with worry for Juno after the party. Okuda caught the flash of her displeasure, guessed she was furious that Juno had abandoned her, and desperately hoped they'd make peace. Okuda replayed the chaos, scheming what deadly weapons the serpent's scales could become as dread coiled in his gut at its presence in these parts. He assumed the dungeon had swarmed with monsters again, and that tackling it solo wouldn't be enough. Okuda realized he'd only escaped by luck. Unarmed, the fight could have gone deadly, and that shook him into sharpening both his combat skills and his magic. Okuda implored Kai-sensei and Han-sensei to train him, convinced wind magic demanded grueling training and hard-won experience to improve. Okuda brimmed with confidence that perfecting the basics would let him unleash higher magic like a tornado. His next target was unarmed parrying, and he figured adding a few martial arts techniques couldn't hurt. Kai unleashed a rapid, razor-sharp string of moves right in front of him. Okuda's mind screamed, "I can't do that! Wait!" while indignation burned inside him that no one understood how he'd lasted this long. Okuda refused to die while learning a new skill. The cold truth slammed into him. There was no choice. The system chimed, announcing Okikeigo had unlocked a new skill called Moonflip. He let out a ragged exhale, stunned he'd pulled it off on his first try. And Okuda decided this world was downright bizarre. He hadn't expected to learn this much here. Okuda steeled himself and pushed fear aside, dove into the basics of the other elements' magic, watched wind slice through the kites, remembered there are only 6 elements: fire, water, wind, earth, light, darkness, and never imagined light magic would be so useful at night. A fierce itch to see how far his light magic could reach seized him, and when he looked back, the carcass lay already hacked to pieces. The butcher crowed it was the most delicious snake meat. Okuda flashed a grateful nod, probed cautiously if it truly tasted that good, and offered to sell it. You could tell that once he realized where the dish came from, he'd pull back from taking a bite. His jaw dropped when the meat cost a staggering 8 gold pieces. He shouldered the scales, fangs, and poison glands and walked off. The cutter bade him farewell, and Okuda answered with a grateful thanks for the help. He smelled a surge in demand for scale armor and moved to sell it to Margot. Okuda arrived at Margot's house. Sarasa's eyes locked on the scales and she gasped. Margot instantly shouted he'd buy it. Sarasa snapped that it was hers. Okuda, utterly baffled and convinced they were husband and wife, couldn't follow the quarrel and promptly declared the scales a wedding gift. Seeing them on their honeymoon, he refused to ruin their vacation and handed the scales over for free. As he turned to go, he announced he was leaving, but Sarasa called him back, begged him to wait and thrust a bottle into his hand. Recognition slammed into him, the exact liqueur from the wedding. He said it was a gift, and refusing would have been rude, so he accepted it with a grateful smile and, at parting, asked to see you. At home, his breath hitched. He couldn't deny the looker was absolutely breathtaking. Sleep slammed into him as he replayed the day's wild events, and Okuda stared, stunned by the sudden, crushing tiredness. He scooped up his puppy Ash, crushed her to his chest, and whispered, "You're a good one." Okuda grinned as the ash wolf's fang dangled at his throat like a savage trophy, a talisman he hoped would protect him. He snatched the dagger, spun it in his hands as his mind raced through its possible futures, paused, chose water as the perfect element to enchant it, and a cheerful grin broke across his face. Triumph hammered in his chest. He'd finally conquered the art of enchantment, though Margot was usually the one called on to do it. Suddenly, Juno's voice cut through the air, calling Okuda. Okuda flinched, confessed he was scared, and blurted, "What are you doing?" And Juno snapped a sharp gesture toward whatever demanded their attention. Okuda blinked, confused, then leaned in to decode the gestures. Then it clicked. The other man was talking about drinks and subtly flirting with the girl. He was sure Juno was beckoning him into a tavern where he'd either be discharged or meet girls. Juno said he was heading home and would be back at night. Okuda hesitated but agreed, a knot of doubt tightening. None of this fit Juno's usual behavior. Suspicion flared when his friend refused the usual drink and chat, and Okuda wondered if something was bothering him again. He remembered how he used to drown the stress of brutal workdays in a drink. Night fell, and he knew he couldn't take the puppy Ash, so he left him with Sarasa. Once he reached the city, he realized he'd been right. Then Margot barged into the shop, and the whole conversation snapped to delivering daggers. Margot shot him a quick thank you, announced the shop was still open, and beckoned him inside. Okuda said he'd return soon and strode away. Margot nodded, offering no objection. "Sarasa's shop, Okuda," bellowed her name, snapping her attention back. He caught the emptiness on her face, no joy at all, and a cold doubt slammed into him. Had he just walked in at the worst possible moment? The instant she saw Ash, Sarasa's whole face changed. Joy exploded across her features, and she christened the little pup on the spot, smothering him with hugs as she swooned over his cloud-soft fur and gentle heart. Okuda entrusted her with the dog, announcing he was heading out to spend time with his friends. He winced. He should have just admitted they were heading to the tavern, so he jabbed a thumb at the door, mimed clinking tankards, and flashed a sly grin that screamed booze, wild fun, and maybe the company of a few girls. Okuda's stomach dropped as Sarasa's expression snapped. He knew he'd made a cringeworthy blunder, and her displeasure hit him like a slap. He pressed a coin into their palm as compensation and pleaded again to be allowed to care for the dog. Okuda finally caught up with Margot and Juno, thanked them for waiting, and grinned when he spotted they'd already started drinking. Margot beckoned him to join. Okuda swallowed hard and nodded, trepidation prickling down his spine. He eyed the tavern like an oasis, imagining it as the perfect spot to unwind and dare something new. The meeting place revealed itself, the tavern called Butterfly Cradle. Okuda gaped at the Spartan, no-frills room, and a jolt of recognition snapped through him. Were they really here just to eat, when the place felt plucked straight from his memories of the previous world? He never imagined he'd land in this exact spot, but now that he was here, he steeled himself and refused to turn away. His breath hitched. Each of them had a girl at their side. She flashed him a grin and wished him luck. The Kuda blinked, baffled, unable to parse what the gesture even meant. One of the girls beckoned him to sit beside her. He registered that he'd been handed a calm, beautiful conversational partner. Okuda beamed as he greeted her, bursting with joy at finally meeting her. She answered, pointing out it was already evening outside. He remembered the long, swallowing dark and felt a tiny knot of nerves tighten. And with communication so strained, Okuda urged the girl to exchange letters. She nodded and scribbled Urina on the paper. He slid a treat toward her to grab her attention, and Urina beamed as she thanked him for the polite gesture. Okuda felt like that academy accountant who devoured foreign words on whirlwind business trips abroad, but this time the problem ran far deeper than mastering a language. Okuda started to suspect Margot and Juno had planted him here on purpose to force him to master the local language. He'd secretly wanted something else entirely, and he was dying to know how their evening was going. Okuda snapped his head toward Margot and froze at a bizarre picture that punched through him. He pictured Sarasa ripping Margot to pieces if he ever saw it. But Okuda clenched his jaw and left it as Margot's private business. Okuda snapped back to his chat with Urena, hunting for a new topic when a bold, strange idea lit up his mind. Then music surged in and yanked his focus away. He froze at the bard's song, curiosity burning as he tried to pin down its meaning. Okuda kept trading pinned papers with Urena. To read her notes, he activated his evaluation skill, unraveling her handwriting and deciphering every line. It hit him. The song was pointing to a lone western mountain where a titanic tree has towered for 10,000 years, and deep in its roots a golden flower called Yurien burned brighter than the sun itself. Colossal divine beasts fiercely guard this sacred tree. Legend says a single drop of its flower's nectar can cure any disease. Brew an elixir by fusing this with the rare herb Irene, the healing plant mullein, and a single strand of a divine beast's hair. Okuda's brain lit up. This was insanely interesting and packed with insight. He turned to Yurina and thanked her, his voice brimming with sincere gratitude for the amazing story. In his head, he grinned and confirmed his hunch. Girls in bars really could be the best teachers of foreign languages. Memory flared. His friend hadn't lied. When the meeting ended, the girls waved them off, begging them to come again. Margot shot back with cool certainty they'd be back. Okuda felt a tug to return just to resume his conversation with Yurina. Once they stepped out of the tavern, Margot asked if he liked it, and he grinned, declaring the evening magnificent. A cold certainty hit him. Everything had unfolded exactly as Margot and Juno had orchestrated. They'd been worried because he barely ever interacted with women. Okuda knew that if his friend hadn't pushed, he'd never have stepped foot in a place like this. He believed he could finally meet Yurino, and it was entirely because Margot and Juno had torn down every obstacle to get him there. Okuda crouched and soothed the puppy Ash, surprise crackling in his voice. He had no idea how she'd ended up here. Sarasa and Elsa burst into view before him, and realizing the situation had flipped, he declared he was heading home to crash into bed. Sarasa snapped into action, snatching him and Margot and hauling them home before they could even protest, while Okuda mouthed a silent apology, guilt biting him because he knew he'd played a part. Awkwardness slammed into him. He was sure he'd done nothing wrong, yet guilt kept gnawing at his gut. He clenched his jaw and forced himself to remember his right to remain silent. Margot and Juno plunged into deep bows before Sarasa and Elsa. Respect or repentance. Okuda felt the tension ebb. Then Ash the puppy whirled and buried his nose in a frantic sniff. Okuda demanded to know exactly what he was doing. The puppy plunged its muzzle into Margot's pocket and yanked out an object that belonged to one of the tavern girls, and Sarasa's eyes snapped sharp as she demanded where it had come from. Panic clawed at Okuda as he thought this was the end. Maybe, right here and now, he'd pay for everything. Out of nowhere, Sarasa snapped, "I can go!" Okuda seized the opening, slipped away scot-free, and tossed out a hurried, apologetic goodbye. A single priority slammed into him: sprint home. There was no point lingering on this battlefield. Okuda was up on the roof fixing the house when a sudden, sweet scent slammed into him. Her face lodged in his mind, and, in that electric instant, he knew it was love. If that's a spark, it'll fade fast. He's never smitten for long. He'd finished the work, looked up to find it late and the tavern throwing open its doors, and despite the pull he kept insisting he had nothing to do with her. Yet he craved a tasty drink. The tavern brimmed with brews he intended to try, and it was high time he learned the language. Still, he decided the tavern could help, even though he was nothing but trouble. He burst through the doors and came away with souvenirs the girl adored. She grinned, called it the perfect snack with drinks, and after that, Okuda came around constantly, soaking up every minute he got to spend with her. The more he reveled in fun, the harder reality hit. He never boasted. Yet women at work flocked to him, so he built iron walls around his heart, and watching those walls wound anyone who got close crushed him with pain and self-hatred, leaving him unable to rush headlong into love. He couldn't stop wondering if Irina had seen through his feelings. She poured herself into every chat and every drink to lift him. He vowed he'd never leave her. She actually heard him and always leaned in when he talked about the city and the world. Maybe it's a practiced seduction, but he could tell she truly loved spending time with him. He fixed his gaze on her alone. She blazed like a star, and a fierce curiosity consumed him. He kept insisting he had to know her better, to pry out her secrets, and he vowed he'd reveal his own. She agreed. Okuda never would have guessed time with her could feel so fulfilling. He returned home, thanked the man for watching Ash, said he was glad everything in Juno was going well for him, and the man smiled, suggesting they light a fire. Late autumn had settled in, and winter threatened to be so bitter the boys would see diamond dust shimmering in the air. So Okuda steeled himself for the cold. He bid Juno and the man farewell, left, returned home, and immediately set to work deciding what the gift would be. He poured today's sights into the book, sure curious Yorena would light up. She could add recipes later, not that it mattered. Then he signed it, "To Yorena, from Keigu Okuda." knowing she might deem his handmade gift tasteless but unable to resist seeing how she'd react. He struck a match, the stove roared to life, warmth flooded the house, and suddenly there was nothing to fear from winter. Time slipped by, then he strode up to Urina holding a book. She gasped at the unexpected gift. His jaw dropped when she handed him a book in return. He tore into the country's winter outfit on the spot. Okuda declared it wonderfully warm. Urina gushed that he looked amazing, and demanded to see the book's contents right then, and the moment she began to read, she was enchanted. Okuda knew in that instant the work had been worth it. She devoured the book with wide-eyed wonder, pressed it into Okuda's hands, a battered grimoire of survival basics and ice magic, and drew so close to explain its lines that Okuda clenched his jaw and forced his eyes onto the text. He learned to wield ice magic and poured shimmering frost into the drink. Joy exploded as a new freezing skill unlocked, and then it hit him. He could pull skills straight from books. A lightning-clear idea struck him. He finally knew how Urina forged ice into stone-like chunks and moved to test the magic. The book, like every spell he'd tried, proved results shifted with the energy and time poured in. So he concentrated, shaped icy pebbles and dropped them into Urina's glass. She smiled, thanked him, and offered to read the book together. And Okuda's chest swelled knowing she liked his book. He barely had any time to himself. Hours dissolved whenever he and Urina were together. Being with her felt effortless and calm. Later he went back to Juno, thanked the guys for looking after his pet, and headed home. Night fell and he collapsed onto the bed. Convinced his distance from others sprang from his boss's brutal creed. Being late is murder. Because stealing someone's time is stealing their life. And now he faced the truth that his carelessness had been stealing lives too. In this world he felt none of that spark. Talking with Juno, Margot, Sarasa, and Elsa might have slowed his stride, but that's probably what friendship is. Then his thoughts snapped to Urina. It hit him hard. This wasn't about snuffing out lives, it was about pouring his life into others. Maybe that was his destiny. He'd just blurted something achingly romantic, yet he had no idea what was happening to him. Each thought of her dragged him deeper into a twisting labyrinth. Asked if he liked her or felt disgust, he'd say he liked her, but he couldn't grasp why love had to be so tangled. Snapping out of a daze, he blinked into the city and couldn't even understand himself. He'd come to grab winter clothes before the cold set in, and on a sudden impulse he picked out another gift for Urina. It was a water dagger. The girl leaned in, asked if he was really sure he wanted to give it to her, and swore she'd take care of it. Then raucous voices crashed in as someone began disturbing them, and Okuda decided next time he'd bring a weapon. He couldn't force the question out, but he kept wondering if the other visitors had given her anything. A leaden weight crushed his soul, so he trained by day, still weak, and vowed he'd push himself harder until strength burned in his bones. His pet clawed at the wall, so he checked it out, poised to strike from above if a monster lurked. And a monstrous bear unlike any he'd seen pressed behind the panels. So Okuda unleashed evaluation on it. It revealed itself as a red-furred grizzly, a rare autumnal beast. If it was a fire element, water would be its weakness, so he shoved arrows into the crossbow and leveled his aim. He fired, the bullet hit, and he stood frozen, not knowing if he'd just killed him. Blinded by the grizzly's sudden searing glow, he couldn't see it close in. Then at the very last second, Okuda drove a killing blow straight into its head. His level skyrocketed, and suddenly he could butcher the bear and turn it into a meal. The first time he bit into that unbelievably fresh bear meat, he gasped. It melted in his mouth, softer than any bear from Earth. Then he brewed an egg potion he couldn't resist sipping, and after draining the bottle his limbs felt like they were floating. Igeru's healing potion could restore body parts, the strongest restorative Okuda had found so far. But he recoiled at the thought of drinking it. When he learned what it was made of, he asked Sarasu to stitch a quilt from bear skin and readied himself to go to the city. He tucked a small bottle into his coat, pressed the skin into Sarasa's hands and asked her to guard it. The real reason he'd come to the city was the residence, and his pulse thundered as he drove up to it. He stopped dead before Mr. Baueron's residence. Tony, the guard's eyes snapped to him with recognition. Okuda declared he'd come to see the master, and they escorted him straight to the master's side. They barged into the master's office. Keiga was told to peer out the window and froze at the sight of the master lounging like a retired lord with endless free time. Tony told the guy he'd meet him right after the walk, and the guy immediately pulled out a bottle. A potion that heals body parts. A guru potion. And wondered if it would have any effect. Byron arrived at the office, and he and the guard gaped that such a potion existed. Tony blurted out a request to drink it, while Kigo grasped it was far too valuable to be swallowed like that. But if he hid it, he'd be tormented by nightmares. A sudden surge of strength slammed into Byron, jolting through his veins. Kigo had been right. The master's hand was miraculously restored. This potion would strip him of his helplessness. So they kept it secret. And after wrapping up his business, Kigo said he'd go home. But Bia-run blocked him and snapped his finger. It would be rude to refuse the gift, so he accepted it with a thankful grin. Survival depended on it. We needed money, there were no marketplaces, and no one would understand what he was saying. Winter was already closing in, and Kigo, imagining the monsters he'd still have to face, sank into a sudden gloom. He scratched Ash, who also feared the chill, and chose to look forward to snowfall instead. They'd fling snowballs and he'd don a Santa outfit to give Urina her presents. No Christmas existed in this world, and where it did, it belonged to families. Burning with curiosity if his quilt was ready, he sprinted to the shop, grabbed it, and told the girl to keep the change. Kago's money sat there. Counting the change felt like a migraine, and explaining it would be worse, so he snatched the cash and stomped home. The stove was already roaring. He dove under his blanket, basked in the heat, and told himself he could survive the winter. He was roughhousing with Ash when a sudden knock hammered the door. Juno and Elsa stepped in. It felt like their first solo visit, and since he still had leftover bear meat, he pulled it out and treated them to it. They all loved it. If Kigo remembered right, Elsa didn't drink, so he slid her a glass of juice, then grabbed drinks for himself and Juno. Accidentally running a tavern made staying sober nearly impossible, and the guys turned to Kigo at once, both desperate to tell him something. Out of nowhere, someone charged forward and demanded if the guy was dating Urina. Kigo figured they'd come just to ask that, but everything was tangled, so he dodged the question and shot back. "What are you even talking about?" They understood him and held their tongues as time passed. The guys who'd already started to leave drifted off. He hadn't gone to the tavern the night before, but everything stayed fine. Going to the tavern wasn't a duty. He dove into housework. Snow would block their water gathering, but he could melt the ice that piled up, fill the bathtubs in no time, and with water and supplies on hand, they'd finally take a bath. So he got to work. Movie romance sparkles, real-life grinds. You have to fight to live each day, and Kigo spent the whole day installing the bath and chewing over everything that had happened. Then the next cold day hit. He was building something and snapped that with marriage looming. His boss kept hounding him to compromise. Wasn't that just asking him to give himself up for others? He insisted he deserved the freedom to choose his own life. Survival mattered more than romance. Monsters prowled the world, and if the dragon attacks again, can he keep Urina safe? Protecting himself already feels impossible. She deserves someone stronger. So he brought Margot a dagger. He scrawled his name across the papers, then strode out again. As he tore down the path, panic seized him. Why was he so lost that he didn't know what to do? Idling, ordinary swallowed him whole, and the urge to sever every human tie ignited again. Picture this. His only joys were baths, meals, fishing, and writing. An age with no internet, no games, no social media where people only talked to whoever was nearby. Then the world modernized and suddenly everyone could speak across the globe in an instant. And it backfired. He'd learned to expect their clipped talk. Swap a few words and the conversation collapsed. That distance armored your heart. Because when romance strikes, your chest goes heavy. Most heartache springs from love. So people choose the path that hurts least. When the heart shatters its limits, everything our ancestors left floods through. And a person finally feels the full force of his love. The birth rates plunged because people can't get married. Kigo became obsessed with urine, felt his heart teetering on the edge, and then his mind snapped and fought back. Even though love burned in him, his mind rebelled and he contradicted himself again. This flip-flop had become second nature, and now he sat alone, realizing he should feel better. After he dug into his own soul, it hit him. He was the unhappiest person on the planet. The tavern buzzed with the guys knocking back drinks and laughing when Urina barreled in, breathless and clearly in trouble. Kigo perched in the wild, casting his line, caught his own face in the water's reflection, and spat that he looked like a dead man. And as always, every time, he stood frozen, not knowing what to do. He's an outlier in every way. Went chasing a change of scenery, blinked, and somehow ended up at the river and back with no memory of how. It was heartbreaking. But alive he is, so he must eat and keep pushing on. He'd seared a fish whose roe begged to be pickled in salt and chilled atop ice cream. He could spin it into a cod snack, chilies stashed in the shed. Pickled together, they'd ignite a new flavor, but when he stepped outside, he found Ash barking at the fence. He spotted girls there, yanked the fence open. They bolted through the gap, and the guy blurted, "What happened?" Ash's reaction was instant. Seeing they were probably being chased by monsters, he refused trouble, slammed the fence shut behind them, and barked that they'd be better off inside the house. The girls flooded him with thanks. Kago stood dumbfounded with no clue what was happening. They began peeling off their clothes, but the guy barked that they shouldn't get too comfortable in a stranger's house and demanded they pull their fur coats back on. Ash went dead silent, then his eyes hardened. He said he'd go check for monster tracks outside, and the girls, hands trembling, begged him to spend the night with them. He saw they were bone-tired from running, yet they still offered it to him. He refused, insisting the bed he was about to show them was for guests, led them into the room, lit the stove and left them there, saying he couldn't fathom why they were alone in the city, but that they probably had their reasons and he didn't blame them. Night had fallen. He'd asked them to leave at dawn, and he slipped out to scout. After confirming everything was fine, he dragged himself home, downed a drink, collapsed to rest because he felt awful, drifted off, and a sudden light blasted into the room, yanking him awake. Girls burst into his room and clambered onto the bed. He pleaded with them to stop and leave. They ignored him, and he had to scramble up onto the table. He was about to bolt into the street when a man barreled into the house, declaring these were his girls. Kago's mind scrambled as the stranger demanded the potion's location. Kago couldn't fathom how he knew about the partial action potion, and if he meant the vial that had healed that nobleman's right hand, someone had already spilled the secret. The man lunged at Kago, but Kago scorched his hair and sent him flying out of the house, suspecting Heinrich had sent him. The man bolted. Kago's mind sprinted for a plan as he stared at the girls and felt his certainty shatter. He had no idea what he was doing and couldn't picture any right moment to send them into the cold. Then beyond the fence, he spotted a cart with Margot. His jaw dropped. He never expected to see them. Fear tore through the guys for Kago. They spilled everything, and the picture snapped into focus. The girls had been drugged. Urena pressed the beauty salon staff, and it came out that the ex-Mohawk, cast out of the red light district, had ordered 3 Lantern District beauties to ambush and kidnap Kino. Urena learned of the plot through her entertainment district contacts, she told Margot and the others, and they sprinted to the scene. The girls were herded into the blacksmith's hut to sleep. Margot slipped up to Kago and whispered that Urena was racked with worry for him, so they sparked an impromptu party. Kago tried to drag the 3 kidnappers in, but shame pinned them silent and they refused. Food was scarce and night was deep, so they'd have to make do. He thanked the guys for waiting, then announced today's new dish, cheese and cod roe, and the guys erupted with delight, eyes wide as they exclaimed in amazement how delicious it was. They savored eating together. Uranus started pouring drinks like it was a ritual. Kigo asked if he could talk to her outside. They slipped out together, and then, for some reason, he stopped showing up at her store without a word. The cold hit like a knife, and she shivered instantly. Kago, stunned she'd rushed after him in those thin clothes, blurted an apology, draped his fur coat over her, and they stood together staring up at the sky. Snow exploded from the sky, blanketing everything in white. Urena glowed like an angel, pristine white wings unfurling as a radiant, wide smile burst across her face. Kago blurted an apology for skipping her shop. He had to tell her what he wanted, had to confess his feelings before Urena vanished into the light snow, and the girl asked why he was thinking. Kago admitted she haunted his every thought, and, hard on his sleeve, blurted that he loved her. She answered she loved him too. They stared into the distance with relief. He brusquely shook the snow from her. She gasped, "What happened?" Tears stung his eyes. Kigo realized he'd started crying before he even noticed. In that heartbeat, a fierce longing seized him, as if it would melt away with the snow. If Urena was in danger, he'd be the first to rush to her. Whenever she sank into sorrow, he wanted nothing more than to stay by her side. He told her everything was fine, and the tears fell anyway. He steeled himself to be her shield and sword as angelic wings spiraled through the night. Ash sprang out from somewhere. The guys watched their confessions play on screen, and awkwardness hit everyone like a punch to the gut. Moments later, the crowd erupted, showering Kigo and Urena with congratulations. The young couple exchanged affectionate looks, then laughed and bantered with the guys about Kago and Urena's love. And before long, everyone was drunk. Kago never imagined the night would become such a joyful, perfect mess. They collapsed side by side on the floor and fell asleep. One guy decided dawn was coming and vowed to cook rice soup for everyone. Urena sobered up in a flash, but his hangover was so brutal he stayed sprawled out for 2 more days. Dawn hit and everyone was already scrambling, slinging on packs and sprinting for the door. Each took their post. The guy bade Keigo farewell, wrapped a blanket around Yorena, picked up a few local phrases. Yorena caught a few Japanese words, and a small, bright happiness flickered between them. They promised to meet later and exchanged quick goodbyes, leaving Keiga alone. Sneezes suddenly racked him, but Ash shrugged and said everything was fine, and it was time to go home. Only hours after everyone left, Kago burned to see Yorena. He couldn't stand the silence. Loneliness gnawed at him, so he grabbed his things and sprinted into the street. I set off down the road, and as I went, he couldn't stop wondering if Yorena still worked at that place. Sure, she'd learned to handle drunk men. The image ignited a furious blaze in him, but he knew she was free to do as she pleased, and that interfering would steal that freedom, so he forced himself to accept it wasn't a good idea. His emotions unraveled. He knew he shouldn't act on impulse, but restraint failed him, and he stormed into the tavern. Midnight had stilled Margot and the others, so he refused to wake them and didn't call. Alone at the tavern doors, shame burned him. After a long road, he finally stood before his goal, but worry smothered any thrill and he barely noticed his own excitement. If there was ever a moment he had to act, it was probably now. He flung the doors open and stormed into the establishment. He spotted Yorena instantly, every eye fixed on her, and a man pushed through, sealed her off from the crowd and whisked her aside. He pleaded with her not to be afraid. She read the worry in his eyes and thanked him. The visitors bristled at his appearance as he erupted into a bark, and all the girls flooded to his side, visibly moved. They fawned over him, petting him one by one and cooing that he was their little furry client. Keigo figured they had no problem with pets. Ash was adored everywhere like the place's mascot, and Yorena led Keigo to their seats and began pouring drinks. She suddenly materialized, the de facto matriarch of the whole operation every time he saw her, and his danger alarm blared. He dared not cross her, so relief hit him when she only came to say hello, even though her leash-clutching dog made him half expect her to break something. Bandits barreled into the building, spotted Yorena, and immediately reached for her. Keigo knew these were people you didn't mess with, yet they came straight at him. One of them jabbed a finger at his temple and shouted something in the local tongue. He snapped to it. The smoking mohawk was the one he'd set on fire. Pity for the ruined hair flared. But with Yorena working here, he had to settle things quietly. And since he'd given most of his supplies to the nobleman, he was nearly bare. So he pulled out a lone potion, told the man to drink, even though he didn't know if it would help the hair. And the man swallowed it anyway. The mohawk roared back to life. Deja vu crashed over Keigo, and the hair looked even longer than before. Everyone cheered when the man grew hair again. The young man exhaled, picturing a relaxed drink with Yorena. Then the man grabbed her hand and snapped they weren't finished talking. He rocketed into the air and, swinging a fire sword, set his hair ablaze again. The mistress drove a brutal strike into his stomach. He crumpled to the ground, and Keigo stepped forward to thank her. He blurted to Yorena, "You okay?" Blind to the fact that even Mrs. Yorena was now in danger, and it wasn't safe for her to work here, so he vowed they'd leave here together, spun to the manager who declared he was taking Yorena, and silently begged her to let him through, because this was no time for words, and the owner looked far scarier than the bandits. Keigo thrust a pouch of 300 gold coins into the woman's hands. Yorena mattered to him more than any money. The girl also begged the owner to let her go. The owner balked, unwilling, but finally relented. Yorena hurled herself into the woman's arms, choking out thanks as the woman vowed to lure the bandits away so the guys could bolt. And she did. Bandits lunged to grab Yorena, but a woman thundered in and beat them back with fierce, unrelenting blows. Their sprint fizzled out. Yorena and Keigo couldn't run that far, so they ducked into an alley and tore deeper. They dove behind a barrel as Keigo's mind raced to shield the girl, and he froze the puddle solid. His mana was nearly spent. He had to refill it fast, so he blasted wind at a nearby girl. Her skirt shot up and every bandit snapped their heads toward her. They barreled toward her, but the slick ice betrayed them and they skidded out, crashing to the ground. He dropped to his knees and checked for signs of life. Yorena yanked him back, snarling, "Don't you dare lift my skirt frame!" He blurted an apology and they headed for his cart. Words slammed into him. The bandits were behind bars, their threat gone, and he walked off clutching their weapons. They thundered up to the gate. A guard shouted a greeting, and the guys didn't stop. They tore past him and kept driving. They kissed. The howls that had ripped through the night fell silent. The snow stilled mid-fall, and nature itself seemed to cheer. In the hush of the road, with only the carriage's wheels whispering, the girl pressed pen to paper and wrote the boy that if staying with her grew unbearable, If their shared pain crushed them, he could leave. She might cry, but she'd still cling to him, because she loved him fiercely. Urena had Kigo pegged, his urge to vanish, his misanthropic core, and she still took him in, carving a secret escape just for him while he stood there stunned that anyone could be that kind. He was an anomaly in this world, tormented by the nightmare that one morning he'd jolt awake in Japan. The thought of being torn from Urena and Ash tomorrow would crush his heart, so he hid it from Urena, because he couldn't live without her anymore. Thus began his life with Urena. He clung to the hope they'd grow old like this, dreamed that as grandparents he'd tell her, "I love you," every single day. And he was iron certain they'd be fine no matter what. After a while, a sharp knock ripped through the silence at their door. Guests had arrived. Margot and Juno, friends they hadn't seen in ages. They'd been holding Urena's things, and Kiko immediately pressed them about the mother from Urena's old workplace. They hauled everything into the house. Juno leaned in and talked with the girl. Margot beamed and thanked Kaga for the cheese, and Cod Roe declared they'd run out of ingredients. Time to go fishing. The guy decided he'd go fishing and asked Marco to guard the house. Marco agreed. They pressed a kiss to Jarena right in front of the guys, and the guys happily stared at him. Kago flushed and slipped down to the river. Longing for Ash's warmth, he sprinted to finish and get home, but at the road's edge something strange snagged his eye. It was riddled with holes, and up close he saw thorns had punched every one. A shadow lunged from behind. Spike screamed for his back, but his shield slammed up and stopped them dead. The creature was unlike anything he'd seen. He hadn't expected it, so he fired his appraisal skill, and it tagged the beast as a colossal echinoderm, basically a giant sea urchin. Servants are dying in growing numbers. The ecosystem might be collapsing, and that's why this sick ooze crawled into the river. He ripped out a thunder sword, lunged to protect his horse, dove behind a rock and realized the spikes were rigged to fire at equal intervals. When he fires, it takes several others to reload. Mid-reload, he launched himself forward and drove home the opening strike. He slaughtered the hedgehog, experience surged, and his level shot up. And with the water biting at his skin, the guy decided to gut the monster. He fired off the assessment. The analysis barely scratched the surface but looked incredibly promising. And then the guy bit into a piece of hedgehog. Even purple sea urchins from first-class kelp couldn't match this one's taste, and it was huge enough to be scary. He darted to the cart, heaved the urchin aboard, screamed in excitement, and raced to get the prize home before new monsters attacked. He barreled home with his monstrous catch. The boys gaped. They'd never eaten sashimi and probably had never swallowed anything this grotesque. And he set to work cooking it. He slid a bowl of sea urchin in salt water onto the table, hoping everyone would appreciate its taste. The guys sampled it with trepidation, and at first Kago couldn't understand what their reaction meant. They erupted, raving it was divine, so Kigo dove into the main course. He said to get the sea urchin's texture, you mix the dish with an egg, fold it into a soft, fluffy cheese omelet, and the urchin omelet was ready. Joy exploded in him as his friends devoured his cooking. After they finished every bite, they clamored for seconds. While everyone else settled down to rest, Kiko slipped away to the bath. Rest finally demanded him. In winter, he craved open-air swims because the water always greeted him warm. The sky was crystal clear, and the stars burned like jewels. Warmth sliding into his frozen limbs felt irresistible. Someone knocked at his door. He figured it was Margot, and I asked, "Has the food really run out?" It was Urena. When he saw her naked, fear slammed into him. He choked out, "What happened?" as she climbed into the water and stepped closer to him. They sat back to back, Kiko's jaw tightening as she realized the women in this world were relentless, and she turned to him. She shot to her feet and begged to see her body. The guy spun to face her, certain he was a man after all, but he couldn't. He sprang from the water and barreled into the house. He finally uncovered Juno as the main culprit and branded her a pervert. She scrambled, stammering apologies, as the dissatisfied Urena stormed into the house. She seethed after he abandoned her. Kigo stormed over, declared he loved her with everything he had and spilled apologies, then froze as Margot and Juno sneered. He couldn't fathom their mockery when they were the ones to blame. Night swallowed the sky and the boys crashed into bed, but Kago sat hunched at his desk, his pen racing across the page. No exaggeration, in that other world he'd become a shut-in, obsessed with Urena, the love of his life, the girl he treasured above all. He's carrying someone's life on his shoulders now. This time it's real, and the lone wolf mask is shattered. He still has a problem. Aristocrat Heinrich covets the house and keeps sending thugs after them. If urine is endangered by the location, that's a whole new nightmare. They do have stacks of money, and the chickens are fine so they can bolt. He slammed the doubts shut and vowed to stay. He wasn't alone. When he woke tomorrow, he'd face it and talk to the guys. That day he laid bare the whole truth to everyone. He had restored Master Byron's right hand with a potion, and the attack on Urena was most likely orchestrated by Byron's son Heinrich, who sent the thieves. They landed on the same verdict he'd come to last night. If the aristocrats in power moved, they'd snatch him before he could fight back. He and Urena would bolt from the house by carriage, and Margot pressed a map into Kago's hands. A map sprawled across the table, tracing the surroundings of the Kingdom of Lancaster. He hadn't needed it until now, but it promised a fast lay of the land. The guy thanked the man with a grateful grin. Urena confessed to Kago she'd never set out on a journey before and was itching to go. Margot agreed, grinning, and called the whole trip a blast. He vowed he'd topple Henry and then come for him. But for now, he'd revel in the trip with Urena while the others handled the rest. Kago thanked Margot and said since they'd decided, they could start packing right away. The chickens were delivered to a farmer who knows Sarasu. Margot left with Juno, a part-time monster hunter. They took Elsa too, and Kago, though he didn't want to burden them, reluctantly insisted on a proper goodbye. He shoved his things into a bag, scribbled a letter to his best friends pleading they read it alone, then dropped the last crucial reveal. He'd be traveling with Urena, and he had to take a step. The flower thrusted into her palm. She stood dumbfounded, understanding nothing. He swore he'd love her till his last breath and throw himself between her and any danger. He second-guessed whether he'd said it right, knowing no words could ever capture her beauty. The girl, tears brimming, vowed she'd love him all her life and called him her son, the one who shines every day. He echoed the oath Sarasa had taught him, a promise of a happy marriage, pressed a single special flower into her hand, then bolted away, vowing a wedding for just the two of them. Ashbark's eyes hardened. He realized Kago was a real priest. After this, a strange courage ignited in him. He barked one more reminder that he'd left them letters, announced he was setting off on a journey, and the goodbyes slammed into them like a punch to the gut. They couldn't linger in this place another second. The fight ahead would only intensify. Kago was sure they'd never set foot here again. Margot proclaimed Kago would topple the nobility, but Kago didn't truly believe it would happen. He clung to the hope the guys would take care of themselves and find happiness, and vowed he'd protect Urena. The wolves ran level with them. Urena beamed, and when Kago pressed her about what Margot had given him, she said it was a slingshot, a self-defense tool that, with the right tweak to its projectile, could pass for a real weapon. She'd gotten it from Heinrich, who apparently collects them. Kago was almost certain Heinrich was hunting him, and he didn't think he'd live long enough to regret his choices. That potion had no business seeing daylight. They teetered on the edge of catastrophe, and a trip that didn't involve any of this sounded like paradise. So he forced himself to call it a win. They were headed to Tirana. Driving at night on unfamiliar roads was treacherous. Even with the wolves guiding them, they kept their guard up and pulled off to rest. And for Kago, some of those stolen pauses felt like a honeymoon. They galloped beneath a scatter of stars, honeymoon romance crackling between them, but where they stayed, the guys were in full view. The carriage rode roofless, but Kago gripped 3,000 glittering gold coins, enough to buy a covered carriage, and he wondered if the other guys were staring at the moon right now before he fell asleep with Urena. The next day, birds exploded from behind the trees. Kago's instincts snapped to attention at an incomprehensible sound. A cockatrice monster revealed itself. Urena lunged to shield him, but he snapped it was too dangerous and told her to fall back. He realized he wasn't alone anymore and that they'd survive together, and while the monster still hadn't noticed them, he ran a quick assessment, and new information popped up. Kago unleashed his summon. A feral pack of wolves surged forward, tore the cockatrice apart and devoured it. Pinned and powerless, the monster couldn't strike. He vowed the next shot would be a poison arrow to finish it for good. He fired, it struck true, and the beast fell. Only one thing left: kill the monster. His summoned creature had lunged at him. The cockatrice was about to unleash poisonous breath, and he howled to the blue wolf to retreat. Time had run out for the wolf. Kago's chest tightened as he realized things were dire, and Urena burst onto the scene to pull them back from the brink. They attacked the monster together. A sudden level-up hit Kago, but he scoffed at it and teleported a detox potion straight into the wolf's mouth. He pinned his hopes on it, but it failed him. They dug his grave. Kago lowered him into the earth, and voice raw thanked him for protecting them and for insisting on staying with them until the end. Weakness evaporated. Power detonated through him, as if the very air rose to honor the hero's triumphant return. Henry slammed the reports, furious over the bandits' 2 failed ops and the fact the men had slipped away, and shouted, "What the hell is going on? I don't want apologies, I want results!" They blurted that the mafioso they'd hired warned Johnny and his gang, the 7 Devils, and a man named Kigo were extremely dangerous. If that happens, they'll pounce. Bind Kigo and Yorina, drag them before Heinrich, and plant them at his feet. He bursts out laughing, tells them to forget it, and everyone gets back to their real business. The man slammed the bell. A servant rushed in, was tasked to fetch the captain to his office and gather about 50 people, then swore to the master he could be relied on. Henry knew that with Jill there in person, Kigo was doomed. If they dared take his girlfriend hostage, he'd be forced to brew a potion to restore body parts. He'd already cut a deal with the Church Inquisition for a special torture chamber, and he'd make those boys pay, so they'd never again enjoy a decent life. Just like the Daggers' uprising, someone was bound to rise. They seized complete control of the city council, even bent adventurers Guildmaster Schulag to their banner, and Heinrich finally believed he was no longer his father's toy. Henry knew executing or jailing them would wreck his image, so he settled on driving his henchmen out of Leicester and slapping the rest under house arrest. To start, he sent Donnie and the others to run his father's lieutenants out of the city. That day, Kago slipped a letter to each boy and strictly forbade them from reading one another's. In his note to Margon, he admitted the awkwardness of writing, declared he planned to overthrow Henry while begging Margon not to take him too seriously, promised he'd be safe in Urina, and vowed that if they were pressed, they'd bolt the other way. When he first arrived in this world, Margot handed him weapons and armor for free, and he burned with gratitude. Without that gear, monsters would have torn him apart. He started showing up at Margot's house every chance he got, which was annoying but oddly fun. He knew he could be a little unsociable, and watching Margot go out of his way to keep him company, he silently thanked him, feeling wordlessly that this was the only thing that had saved him. He implored Margot to watch over everyone in Leicester, especially the adventurers, whose lives depend on the dragon's anvil. He wished the best for him and Sarasa, ordered her to keep Sarasa and Elsa blind to his doubts about ever returning to Leicester. He was a man of few words, so he left things as they were, hoping he'd understand why. And with the letter crushed in his hand, he wished Kigo to take care of himself. Kago scrawled an embarrassed letter to John, too ashamed to say it aloud. After telling Margot he feared he'd never return to Leicester, so he wrote because he owed John everything. They smashed the cockatrices together in a brutal, back-breaking fight he couldn't have won alone, and when they did, he felt unstoppable. He fell for Sarasa and felt hollowed out and lost, clueless what to do. But finding Elsa lit his heart. He vowed to head north to the city of Tarrant, then keep traveling to guard Urina until she was safe. He insisted a man protects the woman he loves and expected them to understand, apologized, confessed he'd stay forever if he could, but the situation wouldn't allow it, begged them to look after everyone in Leicester, and told them not to worry because he'd be happy with Urina. Finally, he implored them, steer clear of too many adventures and don't make Elsa cry. Make her happy. Don't tell Sarasa and Elsa he's unlikely to return. Let them talk it over, and his hut would be a handy refuge in the forest if he wanted them to use it. He could live with Elsa. Sarasa gripped the key and bade him goodbye, and John vowed he'd help and wished him luck for his first big adventure. Kigo fired off a letter to Sarasa saying she might be worried he wouldn't make it back to Leicester, but he vowed he'd return, and Ash, the one she always cared for, would miss her. When he first arrived, she struck a deal for herself, and when he couldn't tell right from wrong, she kindly guided him into the Adventurers Guild, because without her, he'd have died long ago. He blurted that the raw sea urchin he'd eaten yesterday was actually an egg from a water monster's nest, said he wanted to feed the eggs to Juno and Elsa, but wouldn't manage it soon, added the eggs lie in the river he always uses, and she could ask Margot and Juno to fetch and bring them, warned their weakness is lightning, and told her to tell Margot and Juno to watch the spikes, and noted they swoop at enemies every 3 seconds. He'd written so many details it defies summary, leaving it as is. Eliza had shown him endless kindness, and he swore he'd rush back to Leicester to see how she was holding up. She and June could take the hut as their own. He didn't mind them living there. June, drawn to the call of adventure, would watch over him, and he'd be grateful if she didn't fret. Eliza had always shielded Ash, and it cut him that they'd be apart so long. But fate had decreed it. She pressed the letter into June's hands. He met her gaze and said he understood every word. Kago smiled, wished them happiness, and refused to say goodbye, while Juno promised Elizabeth he'd come by sometimes to clean and keep her company. Margot seethed with misery as he spat misanthrope at Kigo for refusing to live in Leicester. He couldn't fathom living without their help. The man collapsed into despair, convinced Keigo must be free. He slammed a pen to paper and ripped out a letter to Master Baron and everyone he knew, vowing he'd defeat Henry and save his friends. That was all he could think about at that moment. Ash roared in his native tongue that the master had bestowed that precious name on him. Whenever a glowing spot bursts from a creature's body, he can read the color of its soul. When Master and Yurina stand side by side, their soul color blazes like living fire. With Master and Yurina reunited, his soul's color blazes brighter than ever. He ached leaving Sarah and Elsa, their memories ember warm in his chest, and now he hurtles into thrilling fun and adventures with Uncle Blue Wolf. Uncle Blue Wolf poured knowledge into him, pointing out directions and every village, even the Wolf Village, which guards a towering sacred tree said to be over 10,000 years old. And when a wolf dies, he merges with that tree and rises as a heroic spirit. Wolves blaze with courage, standing toe-to-toe against the mightiest foes. The next master must train slowly and never rush his growth. Next time he must learn to speak clearly. The wolf was kind, sometimes stern, and utterly courageous. Cackatree struck him down, and he and his uncle's friends chanted a requiem for Wolverine, as his soul tore free and rose into the sky wrapped in a warm glow, before he was pulled back into the vessel of his soul. While the wolves hissed that Master Kago was terrifyingly strong. He had even defeated Ash's mother, who had been their master. Ash only knew it in hazy fragments, his mother's face a fading smudge. He remembered her lunging at the master and the master toppling her. That's all he knew. Ash prowled like any wolf, bred to accept the jungle's law. The owner and uncle battled for life and protection, and if he fell to a stronger foe, he'd die. So Ash refused to see the owner as his mother's enemy. Not just powerful, but kind, with a soul of pure light. He swears he'll keep fighting for his mother and uncle who watch Ash from the tree. He'll fight for his owner, and the wolves, seeing the little one grow stronger, spared no effort. They ripped themselves away from the spot where the boys buried the blue wolf and pushed on to the city of Tyrant. After a while, its bulk rose before them, and Yurina warned that wandering artists still flood this huge place, so they mustn't leave a single trace. She sagged with exhaustion. No wonder. After nights crammed into the cart, they'd finally reached one of the route's endpoints, with no idea how much farther they'd have to go. He decided she needed a real rest, slipped coins to the boy to guard their things and fetch a few supplies, and vowed everything would be ready by morning. Their apartment had a kitchen, a shower, and a gorgeous room. The guy vowed they'd finally rest today. Then the girl stormed over and growled she wouldn't let him run away today. Time rolled on. One morning the guy showed up with everything he'd promised, even a roofed cart, bought a magnificent horse, and pocketed his payment for the job. Keigo christened the horse Queen May. The boy lit up and called it a wonderful name, and when the young man asked him to help carry his things, the boy shot back, laughing. "How many silver coins will you give me?" He was only joking. Yurina stormed outside and slammed a scrap of paper into his hand. It said the girl wanted to see the city. They were only in the next town. Kiko was ready to bolt for the farthest horizon, and Yurina insisted they at least wander around a bit. He shot back. "We're in the city, of course we'll take a walk." And they stepped out and strode through the streets. They burst into the circus and dove headfirst into a riot of laughter and dazzling thrills. After the walk, they checked out of the hotel, aching for the city tour they would have loved. But something whispered they couldn't afford to linger. Kiko's premonition hit dead on, and they had no clue they were only a hair's breadth from disaster. The moment a noble of the Tyrant tipped him to Keigo's whereabouts, Henry charged after him but missed. He summoned the Jiru Corps and reached the courtyard only to find it already empty, then accused Keigo and ordered his men to plaster wanted posters across the city. Keigo still slipped through their fingers. He's not that easy. He toyed with posting a massive bounty, but a corpse would be anticlimactic. If Henry overplayed his hand, rival nobles would sniff out his talent. The potion belonged to him alone, so he had to move in secret, break him into submission, and then force Yurina to be tortured before his eyes. He barked at the guards to fetch him a horse, demanded a new woman, and vowed to give the guy a brutal taste of humiliation. Johnny prowled the streets as a thug, raised in the slums and locked in a huge rivalry. Bruised by past fights, he began to revel with his minions, and in the end, he owned a magnificent mohawk that flooded him with joy every time he was praised. One day they took a job from a white-bearded elderly gentleman, and as they put his plan into motion, his behavior turned strange. Stage 1. Seduction. Stage 2. Kidnapping. Hatch, everything exploded into failure. They had their weapons ripped away, and Johnny even lost his precious mohawk. Urena slung drinks in a cramped tavern she called family. Each of the others carried a buried past, and those shadows gnawed at her too. Her older brother Sato inflicted burns and cuts, tied them up, unleashed brutal violence and spat vicious insults, turning their childhood into a living hell. And when she was 7, her mother died by suicide. Once, while their father's eyes were elsewhere. The boys bolted from home and scraped by on their own in the slums. He always piled her plate higher and left his own nearly empty, starving himself until his body hit its limit and illness made him faint. He fainted, and moments later he was dead. Her world went hollow as she sat on the roadside, waiting for death's embrace, when someone extended a hand to her. Massive hands swept her up effortlessly as she tried to speak, and she still remembers the warmth and kindness in them as they enfolded her like wings. Josephine, her owner, scooped her up, fed her, tucked her into a clean bed, and let her heal. As her sight sharpened and her voice returned, the girl burst into tears and threw herself into the woman's arms. She threw herself into chores and soon landed working at the tavern. Everyone kept to their own duties. Nobody probed her past, and they welcomed her with open arms. And as peaceful days slipped by, the wound in her heart at last began to heal. Sometimes her mother forced brutal self-defense drills on her. She used to be confused, but now every lesson clicks. Kids get snatched, sold, and paraded as toys for the nobility, and her mother has already pulled her back from that fate twice. She arrived at her brother's grave and poured out the story of her new life and job as if he could answer, felt his presence choke with emotion. And then the news hit. Her father had passed away. In the tavern, she met the very man she'd bind her life to, Kago. Now he sat, turning over Yorena's words that she loved the red jure bear flowers sprouting from roadside dirt. Far from elegant but fierce in their resilience, which gave her strength. She poured out her past to him, and because she opened up, she trusted him. He even told himself she probably assumed he hadn't noticed. But once they moved in together, she stopped hiding her tattoos, and he was stunned. Not by the number, ink was the fashion here, but by how casually Urena bared herself. Pure love exploded inside him for the first time, and he swore he'd never meet anyone as breathtaking as Urena again. One day, a giant sea urchin sprang out of the water and attacked them, but the boys joined forces and crushed it in seconds, barely breaking a sweat. They tore into cooking dinner, parceled out the responsibilities between them, and settled into peace. They stormed the kitchen and whipped up a mouth-watering feast together. They went to bed. When Urena dozed off away from the mattress, Kago scooped her up and carried her back to the covers. He could climb in and sleep, but it wouldn't feel right now that he wasn't alone anymore. When he first visited her workplace, she cut through the staff like a calm shadow, keeping men at bay, her tattoos a mask over the raw scars in her mind. Despite everything stacked against her, she still flashed a fierce smile and rode a wave of happiness because amazing people surrounded her. Every girl there carries her own shadowed past, yet they stand united, bound together because their mother saved them. When her friends pressed her about being lonely, she grinned and said she was thrilled to set off. It showed where her true home lay, and he vowed he'd one day bring her back, because if she were flawless, he'd never have fallen this hard. She fought tooth and nail through bitter, lonely days to survive. Maybe, just like Jorbera, that's what made him fall for her. So he poured his apologies and raw, honest feelings into a letter. When the girl wakes tomorrow, he'll lay bare the full force of his love. The next morning, she still wore an offended frown, but his bright "good morning" instantly broke the ice. She then learned he hadn't confessed his love the night before. He'd completely forgotten, which explained her hurt. So he pressed a letter into her hand and asked her to read it. She clutched his letter and the picture book he'd given her, rereading them until the words wore thin even though they were close. He'd been exchanging letters with a girl from another country, and with each note they confessed their love again. Kago was in love with her every day.